I'm Reginald Hutland, producer of the new film Emperor. I'm so excited to join you, albeit virtually, at the 111th NAACP convention.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Dio Kinney. It's great to be with everyone at the NAACP today. In the film, I play Shields Green, a man everyone knew as Emperor, perhaps because he was descended from African royalty. Shields is a true hero of American history who not only escaped slavery, but who worked with Frederick Douglass and then fought for the freedom of all men with John Brown at Harper's Ferry.
You're gonna love this movie. Some people may go, I don't know, it's a slavery movie, but it's not. It's a freedom movie.
Yes.
It's a movie that one of the critics said, you know, this is like a cross between Black Panther and Birth of a Nation. And I think they're right. So we really want to show you this exclusive trailer. Emperor is available on demand, pretty much anywhere things are streaming. You can see it on iTunes, you can see it on Amazon, you can see it on Google Play. Look, if you can watch something, you can watch Emperor. And quite frankly, I can't think of anything better than to watch Emperor. Most importantly, a portion of the proceeds for the film go to the NAACP. So when you and your friends and neighbors watch this movie, you're helping support the NAACP even more than you already do. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We hope you really enjoy this exclusive trailer. And most importantly, don't forget, we are in an election year. If you haven't registered to vote, go register to vote. And most importantly, hit those polls in November. And together, we all can impact change.
I'm going to meet up with John Brown at Harper's Ferry.
I need you to be the spark that lights the fuse of rebellion. Emperor, you're going to get yourself killed.
Mr. Douglas, we can't all fight this war with the pen. Some of us fight with the gun.
You do this and you're dead.
I'm already dead.
That man escaped your plantation and single-handedly killed 3 of your men.
Say you killed a bunch of white folk.
Everybody talking about you.
Is they gonna be here any minute?
I guess I'm in trouble then. You know why they call me Emperor? Because my granddaddy was a king. You better just fight for your life. We gonna be free.
It's too risky.
We're not just your slave anymore. We're a symbol.
Hey, Black America. I'm voting in this election because everything is at stake, including whether we decide to go forward or backward.
Our history is really unique in that every stage of our lives since being brought here in bondage, we've fought to matter, to be counted as human, to be counted as deserving of rights and protections, and to be counted as citizens.
We have an opportunity come November to chart a better course for ourselves by electing officials, not just within the White House, but on a local level that directly impact our day-to-day lives.
So when we vote, it's more than just picking a candidate. It's an affirmation that we will be counted.
We already know that we have a president that wants to keep us away from the polls. So show him what you've got and show up in force.
But we at the NAACP are fighting, even filing a lawsuit against the Postmaster General to ensure that your right to a fair election is being recognized in this moment.
No matter what they try to tell you, every single vote, including yours, counts.
So don't forget, vote in this election and make a plan to vote. Make sure that your friends and your family have a plan to vote.
This year, there's another really important way to be counted, the census.
You've got to take it before September 30th, and that makes sure that we're going to get all the needed resources for our communities to rebuild our infrastructure and to make sure that we live full and dignified lives.
Standing up for our rights comes in many ways, and in this year, voting and responding to the census are both included.
This is our opportunity to lean into our own collective power and ensure that our community is represented.
This is our voice. This is our movement.
Hi, I'm Reginald Hutland, producer of the new film Emperor.
Good afternoon. It's good to see everybody, and it's great to be here today for this panel in which we're going to dig deep on the state of voting rights in America and voter access to the polls in this challenging moment. A COVID pandemic, a national election, and what some are calling a reckoning with the nation's racial discrimination. We have a all-star lineup of folks who I have known for a long time and had the opportunity to work with over the course of many years. And so I'd like to briefly introduce the panel, which I can't decide if they are best called the Dream Team, the Supremes, the Super Friends, but some version of that I'm sure you will see, and maybe we can have a vote and chat at the end, because it's an extraordinary group of advocates and civil rights leaders who have extraordinary experience, deep perspectives, and a lot to share with the assembled NAACP audience. I begin with Sherilyn Ifill. Sherilyn Ifill is the president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the nation's oldest civil rights law firm, and led the NAACP Legal Defense Fund since 2014, and this is her second tour of duty at LDF. She started out at LDF some years ago as an assistant counsel and had a very distinguished career after that as a law professor. Sherilyn is a voice of strength and rectitude on issues of civil rights. She's a fearless advocate, and you will see that she has deep knowledge about the area of voting rights, which was one of the areas that she litigated for many years at LDF, and in an area in which she continues to be very active. So we're delighted to have Sherilyn with us. Next, we have Vanita Gupta. Hi, Sherilyn, welcome. Next, we have Vanita Gupta. Vanita Gupta is the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights. The Leadership Conference is the nation's oldest and largest civil rights coalition. They do a lot of work across the country, but they're the leading voice on civil rights legislation and policy in Washington, D.C. Vanita came to that position as head of the Leadership Conference after a very distinguished tour of duty as the nation's chief civil rights law enforcement officer in the Department of Justice, where she headed the Civil Rights Division of DOJ. Before that, Vanita spent time and worked on very important civil rights cases at both the ACLU and before that at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So delighted to have Vanita here. And as you will see and hear and perhaps know already, she is a clarion voice for justice on all of the civil rights issues that we face today. Next in our lineup is, welcome Vanita. Next in our lineup is Kristen Clark. Kristen Clark is the president and CEO of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. And the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights is a historic organization founded when Kennedy said, "Where are the lawyers? Where are the lawyers?" during the civil rights movement and as the atrocities were happening in the Deep South. There was a call for the lawyers, and out of that call for the lawyers the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights was founded. Kristen now heads that distinguished and august organization that is involved in a range of issues, from voting rights, a leading election protection organization, and I'm sure we'll hear some of that, which is very timely and topical, but they do work in the areas of education, recently moving into criminal justice as well, and a whole host of areas that are on the front edge of civil rights. Among other things, Kristen worked at the Department of Justice and was the chief civil rights law enforcement officer for the state of New York in the New York Attorney General's office. Welcome, Kristen Clark. We can't wait to hear from you as well. Next, we have Professor Gilda Daniels. Gilda is a wonderful friend and colleague and a former voting rights lawyer in the Department of Justice. She's a professor at the University of Baltimore Law School. She has litigated voting cases for enough time to be one of the nation's experts in the area. We will leave it there. Gilda is also, like Sherilyn, an author and has written extensively on civil rights issues, as well as imparting the imperative of standing up and fighting for these issues to students year after year, and making sure that the baton is ready to be passed to the next generation. One of the topics we will talk about today is what that generational fight looks like. And so I'd like to welcome the dream team, the Supremes, the nation's leading civil rights lawyers and voting advocates. Welcome to this panel, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So why don't we kick it off? I have been promised by at least one of you, but maybe all of you, that this is going to be the easiest job in the world, because this is kind of the one where you sort of throw out the question and then you just disappear and let you all talk amongst yourselves. But because we're on video, why don't I at least get us started? So as we think about the moment we're in, and as we face what some have called the most logistically complicated national election since the Civil War, in light of the fact that we are going to be going to the polls at a time of a global pandemic, which may require certain adjustments to the way in which we vote in some places, and which we know has occasioned a lot of public policy discussion, but also and a large national conversation about the way that we will go to the polls and what access to the polls look like. And so I thought I would start there and maybe kick it off to you, Sherilyn, to give us a little bit of a perspective about how we should be thinking about this election that's happening with all of these layers of complexity and intensity.
Thanks, Dabo. And I'm so grateful to be with this extraordinary group. This really is a dream team. And I hope that when people are listening and watching this, the members of the NAACP family and supporters, they will feel confident at the level of expertise and commitment that is at the forefront of organizations working on the issue of voting this year. And I say that because, on one hand, this is an incredibly logistically complicated election without question. On the other hand, I think we have to break down the causes of the complication. Some of it is organic. So you've identified COVID-19 as raising unique challenges. It raises unique challenges, of course, because of the level of transmission of the disease, because the virus has been so hard hitting Black and Latino communities, because most of our poll workers tend to be senior citizens, are elderly, and elderly people are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19, because everyone has to be concerned about their health and safety. We don't know yet whether there will be an intensified COVID outbreak as we get closer to Election Day. So all of those things are true, are organically true. But there's also the man-made or person-made complication of this election that makes it logistically difficult. And that is, in light of COVID-19, there were ways to make this election not incredibly hard. We actually have a structure of absentee voting that is available for people to access. We could have strengthened absentee voting. We could have provided the funds needed by states and by the United States Postal Service to strengthen their infrastructure to prepare them for historic levels of absentee voting. We could have had our own state governments really seeking younger poll workers. We could have had a United States Supreme Court willing to hear cases that would have helped relax some of the onerous restrictions on absentee voting. All of that could have happened. That didn't happen. Instead, what we had was from the highest levels of government, the President of the United States seeking to discredit absentee voting, the United States Senate, led by Mitch McConnell, refusing to move forward legislation that would have provided the necessary funds to both state election systems and the post office to prepare them for the election. And you had a United States Supreme Court allowing stays to go forward. Even we were able to win in court. The Legal Defense Fund organization I lead has filed a number of cases seeking to relax the restrictions on absentee voting, including one notably in Alabama, which has the most restrictive absentee voting requirements, requiring each voter to have 2 third-party witnesses sign the ballot to include a copy of their government photo issued ID with the ballot as well, that therefore requiring people to interact, to have the other people witness the ballot, to get a picture of their photo ID and so forth. We won that case in the trial court. A stay was issued by the 11th Circuit and the Supreme Court refused to hear it for the primary election. Just this afternoon, we completed our trial in that case for the general election. Yesterday, day before yesterday, we won our challenge to Louisiana's onerous absentee voter requirements in the trial court. So we've been winning in the trial courts. We will see what happens. We won in South Carolina. We'll see what happens in the appellate courts. But it's important for us to remember that these are problems that are solvable and could have been easily solvable. And so it's critical that we, in the first 5 minutes of this discussion, talk about voter suppression and understand that that is part of the logistical challenge of this election that is making things so difficult.
Thanks, Sherilyn. A really nice frame for the issues that we're facing. And you're absolutely right that these issues exist on different dimensions. Kristen, the Lawyers Committee is perhaps the nation's leading election protection operation. And I know the 866, Our Vote, has done extraordinary work through the years. How are all of you thinking about the challenges that we face? And what are the big issues in light of what Sherilyn has put on the table that you think we should be directing ourselves to?
Well, first, let me just say how great it is to be here among such extraordinary colleagues. And Debo, I would go with crown jewels as the frame for this group.
Isn't that what Reagan called the Voting Rights Act when he reauthorized it in a different time? The crown jewel of American democracy.
These are extraordinary times, and I think that Sherilyn kind of set the stage out very thoroughly and comprehensively. It's an election season like none other in modern time. The challenges that we face are simply unprecedented. And as you know, we run a program at the Lawyers Committee called Election Protection, which interestingly came about in the aftermath of Bush v. Gore. And there are many people who've been theorizing about whether or not we're bracing for a kind of Bush v. Gore part 2. But election protection is the nation's largest and longest running nonpartisan voter protection program put in place because we felt it was incredibly important to create a nonpartisan space where the public could come forth and bring issues, bring complaints, report voter suppression, but most importantly, get trusted and accurate information about the electoral process. This season, you can imagine the kinds of calls and questions that we're getting, particularly in this season of mass disinformation. Lots of questions from people about absentee ballots and whether this is a trusted method of voting. People who are hearing President Trump's instructions that they should go out and vote twice and are trying to understand how to make sense of that. And of course, that is illegal and discouraged. And, we're really trying to make sure that people don't wait until the last minute. This is a season that really requires, because of the challenges with the U.S. Postal Service and the mail delays, among other issues, that people really activate now to figure out how they intend to vote. A lot of the litigation that we have brought, over 24 cases since the start of this pandemic, has been about opening up access to absentee ballots and making it easier for people to participate. And we want people to take advantage of those opportunities where they can now. But as Sherilyn notes, there's still some hurdles in place in a number of states, and we're fighting tooth and nail to see what we can do to tear down those unconstitutional and unnecessary restrictions at this very, very moment. The Election Protection Hotline is what kind of anchors the program. That number is 866-OUR-VOTE, and we encourage people to plug that 866-OUR-VOTE number into their speed dial and share it with their networks. Our goal is making sure that people are empowered despite the problems, making sure that people are empowered with all of the information that they need to successfully cast a ballot this season.
Thanks, Kristen. But Vanita, I want to come to you next and talk a little bit about the extent to which in this election, perhaps we're hearing more about the ways of voting, and as Sherilyn has suggested, certain impediments being thrown up about access to the polls. And so I'm thinking a little bit about what the national conversation looks like, because one of the, as I think Sherilyn called it, there are some person-made obstacles that are in the way, and there's some information that's being put out there. That's a bit of an unusual circumstance also. It's one thing to be in a campaign and to be trying to get your voters out. It's another thing to have such a trained focus on the apparatus and the processes of democracy. I'm not sure that we've had that before in connection with an election. And so from your national vantage point of all of the groups in the human rights community, what does it look like to you, and how are you thinking about this election from your perspective?
Yeah, and let me echo, I am always deeply honored to be alongside these amazing women, and you too, Dabo, but these amazing women leaders that are really at the vanguard of the fight for the right to vote and are meeting every challenge that we are facing, and we are facing many. So, Dabo, in response to your question, I think right now from the national perspective, and both Sherilyn and Kristen alluded to this, I don't think that any singular strand of what we're facing as a threat or challenge right now is entirely new. Although the global pandemic, obviously not something that any of us have been familiar with in our lifetimes here on the United States shores. But obviously the NAACP and the members represented and who are watching on this call have long been fighting the scourge of voter suppression. What is, I think, really putting this all together is the constellation that we're facing. It's Russian interference that specifically is targeting Black voters and voters of color. It's the degree of virality of disinformation and misinformation about voting that is being amplified on social media platforms. COVID is obviously, in March, as states began to have to postpone their primaries, the only silver lining with that was that states were on notice about what might be needed in order to stand up adequate vote by mail systems, but also create other options for voters who, for whatever reason, culturally, technologically, geographically, are not comfortable or able to vote by mail. And that has meant increasing early in-person voting, making sure it's safe for people to do so, to avoid the kinds of problematic long lines that we've seen around the country, extended online voter registration, the Legal Defense Fund, the Lawyers Committee, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and countless other organizations have just been fighting to make sure that voters, all voters, voters with disabilities, the African-American voters, voters for whom English is a second language, that we have options in this unprecedented election. But we are also facing a new or a set of challenges that I don't think any of us could have ever foreseen, even beyond COVID, which has obviously been just so incredibly huge. The attacks on the U.S. Postal Service, attacks on drop boxes as somehow being unsanitary, the level of noise and misinformation directly from the president himself, who has an incredible bully pulpit. And so in this moment, I think what's really important for us to recognize nationally is that even as all of our organizations and the NAACP and all of you are fighting to protect our democratic infrastructure in this moment, whether it's because we're advocating with local and state of election officials, we're advocating in Congress, we're litigating in the courts. We have to make sure that voters actually have confidence in our democratic infrastructure in this moment. Virginia just started in-person voting today. And if we are only talking about the crises and threats, we may do ourselves a disservice by inadvertently feeding this narrative that somehow our voters, our people, the election's so rigged that why bother? And that is also part of the strategy of voter suppression. And so I think in this moment, it's really important. And it's why, when Kristen's talking about Lawyers Committee's work on voter education and LDF has created this voter portal to give out information, we have to be making sure that voters in this unprecedented election season have, everywhere they go, since elections are run in all 50 states in different ways with different rules, have access to accurate information. Secretaries of State websites have this. Vote.org is a one-stop shop. As I said, LDF and Lawyers Committee Leadership Conference, we're all trying to put out important, clear messages to voters so that people can make a plan to vote early. And whether you're going to vote absentee, apply for your application now, figure out how your state accepts absentee ballots. If you're going to vote in person, find out what those rules are. And if you want to track your ballot, most states have the ability to track your ballot. We need to make sure that voters understand and see all of our own individual power in actually fighting for a democracy and fighting for the kind of country we deserve, because truly everything is at stake for our communities.
Thanks, Vanita. Professor Daniels, I want to turn to you, and I want to pick up on something Vanita said about the way in which we should not become overwhelmed or paralyzed into inaction by all of the obstacles that we're talking about and hearing about. And perhaps there's no better place to have a conversation like this than at the NAACP convention, where the whole history of the Black experience in the United States with respect to voting is of very clearly seeing the obstacles in the way, but being indefatigable in the commitment to push past those obstacles and to get to the ballot box to vote. And so from you, I guess I would ask two things. I want to know some cases that you're looking at or have considered that you think really point to the nature and the depth of the obstacles that we're facing, or tell us something about this moment. But I also want to hear something from you about any best practice or thing that you think people should be thinking about in terms of making sure that they and their family can get, and friends can get to the polls.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Davo. And again, I am honored to be on this panel with all these wonderful warriors, and so happy to see you and share the stage. I'm representing Advancement Project National Office. Our Executive Director, Judith Brown Dianis, is unable to be here today. I'm the Director of Litigation at Advancement Project, and so Davo's asking me about cases. So certainly, I want to talk a little about, certainly echo what others have already said, and particularly in regards to what we are facing as a nation. We certainly, have already discussed how COVID-19 certainly has exposed the fault lines in our society on many levels, in healthcare and criminal justice reform, as well as in voting and elections. And certainly we saw the beginning, certainly, of the shutdowns across the country around the time of presidential preference primaries. Advancement Project filed a lawsuit in Florida days prior to the presidential preference primary to do what certainly Vanita mentioned, which is to say to the state, you need to prepare. You need to have a plan in place to address not only COVID, but to address issues that have been longstanding. Kristen mentioned 2000 and Bush v. Gore, and where we certainly saw the problems that we have certainly with the process of voting with hanging chads and outdated machines. And all of our organizations are working to ensure that certainly vote by mail is not the hanging chad of 2020. because we are seeing that we have seen that these fault lines are being exposed, that we needed certainly ways in which people can safely cast a ballot, which is with vote by mail. But we also know that we always needed more days for early voting, right? And we need to ensure that people can actually cast a ballot safely. Advance Project polled more than 1,000 young voters of color, voters between the ages of 18 and 24 years old. And what we found is that many of them would like to cast ballots via vote by mail, but they would be doing it for the first time. And so we have to do a lot of education, not just for our young voters of color, but certainly for all voters, to ensure that everyone understands the process, how to cast these ballots, and how to make sure that votes are counted. You asked for cases. I think it's everyone has already talked about certainly the cases that and litigation that's going on. There are more than 300 cases, COVID-related, voting-related cases that are going on and across the country that are certainly trying to address these issues and trying to ensure that we all have free, fair, non-discriminatory access to the ballot. And so in regards to education, certainly we all have we can go to the Advance Project website. They have there's information on the vote by mail process. We've been doing a lot of work with returning citizens and working with organizations and who are led by formerly incarcerated persons to deal with the disinformation and misinformation with returning citizens, in that many of them have the right to vote, but because of what they're hearing, that if you committed a felony, then you don't have the right to vote, which is not true, and really depends on where you live. With this crazy quilt of laws, and we've talked about how difficult it is not only to know certainly how you can cast a ballot by mail, but whether as a returning citizen, can you actually cast a ballot? So we have these certainly all of these rules that apply to the right to vote, as well as all of the noise around whether or not a vote by mail is something that people should take part in. I call all of this, certainly this serves as what I call weapons of mass distraction, right? Which is essentially distracting us from what needs to be done, certainly in regards to education and how we're educating people and educating groups, working with grassroots organizations, working with returning citizens to ensure that they have the tools that they need and information that they need, and working with NAACP and other organizations to ensure that we have the information and the tools they need to cast a ballot, and that ballot is counted in the way in which they intended. So we have always been in a fight to vote for the right to vote, and that certainly continues today.
Thanks, Gilda. So all of you have put important ideas on the table, and I want to sort of move us a little bit from some of the conversation we've been having to think about this. I sometimes talk about voting and say that there are two paths to voting. There's democracy's low road, which is the voter suppression and the blocking people's votes, putting intentional obstacles in their way. That's a well-established path, and it has long roots in American history. And we've talked a little bit about it, and sadly it continues. There's also democracy's high road, which is the mobilization road, and getting people out and winning people with your message and outreach and your vision for leadership. And one of the things that is a consequence of both of those things happening is that there are more and more people, and you hear in more and more audiences, about the importance of voting, and people are using different techniques to try and talk to people about voting and get the word out. And so I'm wondering, from the perspective of this group, how do you assess these varied efforts where you have athletes talking about the vote, you have television shows and music personalities and the like talking about the vote, you have celebrities out there talking about the vote. Certainly, we've always had it at the pulpits, souls to the polls, and everything else. But it just seems to me that that talking about voting and democracy in America is much more an everyday household type of item than perhaps it was before the 2000 Bush v. Gore election, and the drumbeat has only continued. So as our nation's experts on these topics, how do you assess the collective impact of these efforts, and are they enough to mobilize folks and to get people to get up off the couch and prepare to vote?
Well, I'll jump in here. I think it's exciting that we're seeing a wide range and diversity of voices that are activating this season. To me, it's a sign that democracy is alive. And a lot of this momentum and energy is happening at an unprecedented moment where we are literally witnessing our nation's biggest racial justice movement in modern time. And I think that there are some interesting parallels. As people are marching and protesting and using their voices to push and press and demand for an end to racial violence and an end to police violence, on a parallel track, we also have people who are reminding the public about the power of their voice at the ballot box, and reminding the public that using their vote as a way to press for change and reform and to hold election officials accountable is a part of the kind of three-dimensional pressure that is needed to break the system. We're at a moment in our country where people are saying enough is enough, right? The police violence, the tragic killings of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd have really prompted action and a desire for change and reform in every corner of our country. And my hope is that we will see those people who are marching and protesting intently every day, embracing the power of their vote itself on election day or before election day as well. If you care about criminal justice reform, if you care about police violence in our country, it's important that we push our lawmakers to do their job, that we hold our election officials accountable for bringing about the change that is necessary. But it's also critical that we collectively wield the power of our voices at the ballot box and think about those elected district attorneys who make decisions about whether or not to prosecute cops who use force without basis. It's important that we think about the power of our voice at the ballot box when it comes to mayors who make decisions about police chiefs who preside over police departments that may be woefully broken and in need of reform. It's important that we think about elected judgeships at the local and state level, incredibly important players in the criminal justice system at a local level. It's important that we think about elected sheriffs who preside over jails and make decisions on things like solitary confinement. So at this moment of monumental protest, I am so encouraged and heartened to see just a wide range and spectrum of voices really pushing people to embrace the power of their vote as well.
Others want in on this one?
Well, I'll just say, Davo, it's a big country, I'm going back to your question, is it enough? Is it too much? I'm thrilled by the multiplicity of voices that are out there encouraging mobilization, because I think that this is a very big, very diverse country. There are lots of different levels of the population that need to be reached with the message. But I think that it's more about what we're saying than just the mere fact that we're talking about voting. I have been waiting for this level of sophisticated discourse about voting at a national level for years. And so I am actually really thrilled to see celebrities and others talking about voting in a very, very sophisticated way. The way we're used to talking about voting, particularly in the Black community, is that we vote. There, our forebears before us risked their lives to vote. Blood was shed on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. All of the stuff that's absolutely true about how we have to honor the struggle that came before us. But what I have seen is us returning to talking about voting in the way that actually was the intention that underlay the voting rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. And Lonnie Guinier, wrote about this many years ago, and we used to talk about this when I was still at the Legal Defense Fund. That the mobilization around voting during the Civil Rights Movement was premised on the idea that voting would give Black people political power and therefore the power to transform the condition of their communities. It was directly related to the condition in which Black people were living, particularly in the South in the 1950s and 60s. It wasn't just an act of, it wasn't a ceremonial act. Of course, there is the dignity associated with voting as a full citizen, as an act of citizenship. But it was understood in very pragmatic terms as giving Black people the power to be able to transform the lives that they were living and to be able to create a different future for their children. So when we now talk about voting in the ways that Kristen was describing and that a number of us have been working towards for years, we have been, for example, really talking about local elections for a long time, because one of the problems we've had with voting in our country is that we talk about it as though it's something that happens every 4 years, when in fact voting happens every year. And actually, I'm actually more interested in what the discourse will be next year than this year, because we do get lots of voices and lots of passion in presidential election years. And what I'm looking for in some of the partnerships that we've been creating with some of those voices, so LDF has partnered with LeBron James's group, More Than a Vote, to try to increase the number of Black poll workers, particularly younger poll workers that we need during this COVID-19 pandemic. We've been forming partnerships with Nike and other high-profile brands and individuals to try to get the word out. And it's great to do that this year. What I'm interested in these partnerships is what is going to be said next year, when the elections on the ballot are largely local elections, are elections for the railroad commissioner and for the town council and for the sheriff and the DA and the local judge and the school board, because those elections are the ones that are most proximate to people in the community, and where the people in those offices have the power to control the day-to-day lives of the people who, Black people in particular, who live in communities around this country. So to the extent John Legend is talking about DA elections, I'm loving it, because that is actually a deeper, richer conversation that is about unlocking our power and not just about showing up at the polls and getting a sticker that says I voted. Last thing, as I often say to people, I include myself in this. I am not indicting others. All of us have had the experience of going into the voting booth, voting for the highest level in the voting booth, the president, the governor, the senator, the mayor, maybe you even know your city council member. And then it says, pick 3 judges. And probably all of us would be lying on this Zoom if we said that we always know who those judicial candidates are and that we intentionally pick the 3 that we know have a record that is consistent with civil rights and helpful for our communities. We may pick them because we've heard of their name, because we know they're a person of color, because they have a D or an R next to their name, depending on what your party is. But very often we don't know who those folks are. When we see the sheriff race on the ballot, do we actually know the choice that we're making between 2 candidates for sheriff, what they stand for? Has our community put the tough questions to them? In my engagement with the AME Church, I've been really pushing our churches to take very seriously this work as well. And I have said to AME bishops, on Sunday morning, several weeks before every election, always sitting on the front pew are people we've never seen before, and a number of them are often white. And those people are there because they are candidates for office and they have come to the Sunday service, usually right before the election. And we're always very polite. The person stands up, they greet the crowd, they wave. Sometimes the pastors or other religious leaders will lay hands on them. And what I have been asking the churches to do is Of course, it's perfectly fine to have people come in, but what about on Tuesday night holding a candidate forum at your church, or at this point at your Zoom church, where you ask questions of them, nonpartisan, but ask them to put their positions before the people, take questions from your membership, and allow them to be accountable so that your members will be voting with an understanding and knowledge of this candidate and what they stand for. So to the extent our conversations about voting are going past the kind of ceremonial nature of voting and into the conversation about political power and making the kinds of changes that we want to see in education, in policing, in criminal justice, in housing, and so forth, then I will more voices. And the test will be where those voices are next year in an off-year election.
And Davo, can I just build really quickly on what Sherilyn just said? Because I think this notion of we've got to vote and then we have to hold people accountable and show that our vote cannot be taken for granted. I think that's certainly true with the block vote, where for too long politicians have taken that vote for granted, but the accountability piece of that is crucially important. But I also think that right now, what is so unique and why we need the LeBron Jameses of the world to be activated right now is that, we are where, as we said, we are facing some major challenges with a smooth, fair, free, accessible election. And we need to eventually get out of going from crisis to crisis, election cycle to election cycle. We need to restore the Voting Rights Act and go beyond it. We need to pass HR 1 legislation that would fundamentally change the landscape for our democracy in this country. So we are in kind of crisis mitigation mode and doing everything that we can to ensure that people can have options at the polls, that they feel safe in doing so. We've taken our democracy in some ways and our democratic infrastructure for granted, and we're seeing some of the most intense challenges to it in recent memory right now. But we also have to keep our eye on the accountability side of things on the other side of this, which the NAACP has a very long and storied history of doing, perhaps unlike any other organization, and to keep our eye on the prize on the long game of not just bouncing around from crisis to crisis, but actually making sure that we are able to advance the kinds of legislation at the state and federal level that actually protects the right to vote in a much more robust way that will sustain and go beyond the kinds of challenges that we're seeing today. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, which is that aside from the election, which is also ongoing, we also have a 2020 census that is ongoing as well, that has been put under extreme duress, both because of COVID and because of political machinations by the administration. We are only weeks away right now from the close of account. And it was, for anyone who was watching, if you haven't filled out the census, please go to 2020census.gov. Tell your friends and family. The census will determine the shape of our electorate and our voting rights. When I was at the Justice Department, the census was the basis for all federal civil rights enforcement. And so I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that as well as part of our democratic exercise of civic engagement in the next few weeks.
Absolutely. And I guess that census piece sort of fits in nicely with the conversation we've been having about efforts to put obstacles in the way, and some of which are beyond our control, or at least the initiation of them is beyond our control. What we do with them is a different question. And then some that are brought to us by folks who are affirmatively trying to put obstacles in the way, including by shutting down the census, right? Stopping the census early. We're in a situation where you might think that you would need ameliorative measures to make sure that you were reaching people, not constricting the period. And yet I take it there's litigation going on and injunctions around the country on these issues as well. So I'm glad that you've brought that into the frame, Vanita. So our panel is directed in part at where do we go from here as being one of our charges, and thinking about what the future looks like. You all naturally have sort of spoken to these things, both in the short term and the long term. Vanita brought into the fray the Voting Rights Act, and last week I was thinking a little bit about the Voting Rights Act, and I was thinking about what happened in Florida. I was thinking about that as sort of a little democracy story of where the people of Florida decided to make the path to the voting booth easier for people who had completed their sentences. And they put that out as a ballot initiative during an election, a statewide election. And the people said that they wanted to make that path easier, and they voted to do it. And then, as I understand it, the legislature came behind them and put additional obstacles in the way to make it tougher. And so I want to ask this group, what would that have looked like if the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act were in place? And what did it look like now? And what does that tell us about what the way forward looks like? Vanita mentioned some of the bills that are pending in Congress and that there has been some movement on. I know that you have testified or spoken up in support of this legislation. What does the future look like? Because it seems like we're never going to be able to just assume that the democracy will be self-executing. We're going to need protections into the future.
Absolutely. Dabo, can I start? And I just wanted to say that when you were speaking, I was reminded of a speaker I had when I was a student at Grambling State University. It was Thomas N. Todd said, "We play the game, they write the rules. We win the game, they change the rules," which is essentially what happened with Amendment 4, which is we were playing the game, had more than 1.4 million people who were disenfranchised because of previous conviction of a felony. And those and people, the people of Florida, led by Desmond Meade and FRRC, said, let's change this. We can't do anything legislatively. Litigation hasn't worked. And let's try a ballot initiative. And beyond the odds, they got the initiative on the ballot and then passed it with more than 64% of the people saying that they wanted more than 800,000 people to actually have the right to vote and not be continue to be penalized because they had been previously convicted. And with that change, and now we've had almost more than a year of litigation to try to materialize what the people of Florida said that they wanted to see, which is to have that large number of persons to actually have the right to vote. And it's classic voter suppression. And you're asking what would it have looked like prior to the Shelby County versus Holder, when the state of Florida would have had to get pre-clearance or get approval from the federal government before they could implement these changes. Certainly, these measures that the state is saying that now those persons would have to pay fines, fees, and restitution before they could actually register, certainly is something that when I was in the Department of Justice, certainly I was in the Justice Department in the Clinton and the Bush administrations. So that's the whole, along with Kristen. So it certainly would have been interesting under both of those. But if you're looking at certainly the standards and the standards, then certainly that would have been something that the ballot initiative and the way that it passed, we would have seen, almost 1 million people have the right to vote, and having this litigation in place, and that is essentially stopping what the people of Florida said that they wanted to see is again, we're playing the game and they're changing. When we're winning the game, the rules are changed, and it just means that we have to continue to fight and continue to fight to vote for the right to vote, and this is not over. Certainly, I'm sure there are conversations about whether or not this case in LDF is brought one of the cases. So Cheryl will speak about that. But we also need to have another way of addressing it, and we'll have to start paying to the extent that we can. There are groups that are working to pay the fines and fees of those persons who have been disenfranchised, which is an example of how we have to use all the tools that are available to us, not just litigation, but also campaigns and policy, and that we're all working to make sure that we achieve the end of having free, fair, and non-discriminatory access to the ballot, and that's going to take us doing all the things that are available to us, including litigation, as well as raising awareness and education and policy, trying to change policy as well.
Thanks, Gilda. We're almost at the end of our time, but I want to give each of you a speed round of a closing thought about what being prepared to vote looks like now, or something we should be thinking about on our topic of where we go from here. So we have about 5 minutes left. If we each take a minute, we'll get to the end.
I'll jump in and just say that, as we round out this conversation, we definitely have to lift up the life and legacy of the late John Lewis. And one of the biggest travesties is Congressman John Lewis not getting to live to see the day where Congress would restore the Voting Rights Act, our nation's most important federal civil rights law. There is so much work that we have to do as a community, but continuing the rallying cry for Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Restoration Act must be one of our biggest priorities as we soldier forward. None of us wants to be in courts mounting litigation at the pace and fury that we have been, but the precise reason why we are litigating in Georgia and Texas and Florida and North Carolina is because we have lost the sacred protections of the Voting Rights Act through that devastating decision issued by the Supreme Court in 2013. As I close, I would just underscore again how critical it is that we arm up and empower ourselves, our friends, and our neighbors to get ready to vote now and make those plans early. Call the 866 Our Vote hotline. But then when we catch our breath, we've got to soldier forward and fight for restoration of the John Lewis Voting Rights Restoration Act.
Thanks, Kristen.
I'm going to cede most of my time to Benita because there actually is so much, on the other side in terms of thinking about because what this has shown us is that we need a actually broader view of legislation and protection than we may have been thinking in the past. I will only say that I encourage people to go to our microsite, vote.naacpldf.org, vote.naacpldf.org, to find out everything you need to know about voting. You can find out about all the litigation that we're doing. You can find out how to volunteer to be a poll worker. You can sign up to be a volunteer with our on-the-ground election protection work for early voting and for Election Day. All of that information is there on the site, vote.naacpldf.org. Get good information, lots of misinformation out there. Get good information. And be ready on the other side for the fight that we need to be able to get the tools we need. And I'll stop there.
Nita.
I'd say just stay hopeful and make a plan to reiterate and use the resources that Sherilyn's talking about, that Kristen's talking about. Make sure that you're out there making a plan and voting as early as possible. It is crucial. Fill out the census as well. Become a poll worker if you can or feel safe and are able. And then, it is about what we do on the other side. And it's about supporting state legislation and ballot initiatives like Amendment 4 in Florida. But it's about also pushing ahead and making sure that when the House of Representatives passes a bill to restore the Voting Rights Act and passes an omnibus democracy reform bill like HR 1, the For the People Act, we're going to be right back at it in 2021 because those bills landed right in Senator Mitch McConnell's graveyard where he refused to even hold a hearing in Congress. We need the force and might and focus of the NAACP and the power of all of you to get behind and to basically fight for a new democracy where the rules are open and affirmative and that we can stop playing defense. And it is a much bigger agenda than perhaps we've seen before. It includes DC statehood. It includes making sure we have same-day registration, early voting, that we are fighting against the manipulation of social media platforms and holding them accountable for spreading misinformation. It's a broad sweeping agenda, Sherilyn said, and we're going to need the force and might of the NAACP. But stay hopeful through this season and stay focused.
Well, thank you for this extraordinary.
Dave, can I just correct the website? Voting, not vote. Voting.acpldf.org. My people will kill me. Voting.
Okay. Yeah. But it's an active sport. It's an active sport. Voting. So I will just say as we close, it's an honor for all of us who are friends and colleagues and sisters and brothers in arms with the NAACP and so much of the democracy work that we do to be here with you and to talk about these issues. Vernon Damer, a famous NAACP hero, a hero of mine, a personal hero, worked to register voters and gave his life in service of the cause. And on his tombstone in Mississippi, his last words, "If you don't vote, you don't count," are emblazoned. And I think it's appropriate as the NAACP is headed up by another brave warrior from Mississippi, Derek Johnson, that we remember what Vernon Damer said. And the way we think about activating that, each and every one of us, is to think about what it takes to expand the vote. And let's have that be you plus two. Make that you get to the polls and then commit to bringing 2 others. Thank you very much to this extraordinary group of women and civil rights fighters. I'm proud to know you, proud to have worked with you, and look forward to being in the trenches with you as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Reginald Hutland, producer of the new film Emperor. I'm so excited to join you, albeit virtually, at the 111th NAACP convention.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Dio Kenny. It's great to be with everyone at the NAACP today. In the film, I play Shields Green, a man everyone knew as Emperor, perhaps because he was descended from African royalty. Shields is a true hero of American history who not only escaped slavery, but who worked with Frederick Douglass and then fought for the freedom of all men with John Brown at Harper's Ferry.
You're going to love this movie. Some people may go, I don't know, it's a slavery movie, but it's not. It's a freedom movie.
Yes.
It's a movie that one of the critics said, you know, this is like a cross between Black Panther and Birth of a Nation. And I think they're right. So we really want to show you this exclusive trailer. Emperor is available on demand, pretty much anywhere things are streaming. You can see it on iTunes. You can see it on Amazon. You can see it on Google Play. Look, if you can watch something, you can watch Emperor. And quite frankly, I can't think of anything better than to watch Emperor. Most importantly, a portion of the proceeds for the film go to the NAACP. So when you and your friends and neighbors watch this movie, you're helping support the NAACP even more than you already do. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We hope you really enjoy this exclusive trailer. And most importantly, don't forget, we are in an election year. If you haven't registered to vote, go register to vote. And most importantly, hit those polls in November. And together, we all can impact change.
I'm going to meet up with John Brown at Harper's Ferry.
I need you to be the spark that lights the fuse of rebellion.
Emperor, you're going to get yourself killed? Mr. Douglas, we can't all fight this war with the pen. Some of us fight with the gun.
You do this and you're dead.
I'm already dead.
That man escaped your plantation and single-handedly killed 3 of your men.
Say he killed a bunch of white folk.
Everybody talking about you.
Is they gonna be here any minute?
I guess I'm in trouble then. You know why they call me Emperor? Because my granddaddy was a king. You better just win for your life. We gonna be free.
It's too risky.
You're not just a slave anymore. You're a symbol.
Hey, Black America. I'm voting in this election because everything is at stake, including whether we decide to go forward or backward.
Our history is really unique in that every stage of our lives since being brought here in bondage, we fought to matter, to be counted as human, to be counted as deserving of rights and protections, and to be counted as citizens.
We have an opportunity come November to chart a better course for ourselves by electing officials, not just within the White House, but on a local level that directly impact our day-to-day lives.
So when we vote, it's more than just picking a candidate. It's an affirmation that we will be counted.
We already know that we have a president that wants to keep us away from the polls. So show him what you've got and show up in force.
But we at the NAACP are fighting, even filing a lawsuit against the Postmaster General to ensure that your right to a fair election is being recognized in this moment.
No matter what they try to tell you, every single vote, including yours, counts.
So don't forget, vote in this election and make a plan to vote. Make sure that your friends and your family have a plan to vote.
This year, there's another really important way to be counted, the census.
You've got to take it before September 30th, and that makes sure that we're going to get all the needed resources for our communities to rebuild our infrastructure and to make sure that we live full and dignified lives.
Standing up for our rights comes in many ways, and in this year, voting and responding to the census are both included.
This is our opportunity to lean into our own collective power and ensure that our community is represented.
This is our voice. This is our movement.
Well, welcome back, everyone. First, giving honor to God, let me extend a hello and a welcome to this segment of the 111th NAACP National Convention. I am your host for this segment. My name is Reverend Alvin Herring. I'm the National Executive Director of the largest faith-based organizing effort in the country, Faith in Action. We're organizing the voices and the power of everyday people of all faiths in 25 states and 115 U.S. cities and 4 countries abroad. Every day, over 1 million people organize with us and through us. With our many members and thousands of faith and religious institutions, we are a leading faith voice offering a new vision for racial, social, and economic justice in America. And we are proud to join the NAACP and its millions of members across the globe in this historic convention. I want to send a special shout out to my brother, the president and CEO of the NAACP, Derek Johnson, who has ably guided the NAACP to unprecedented success and impact. We are praying for you, dear brother, for your success and for the success of this organization because the country needs you both. In this segment, we want to call it Where Do We Go From Here, Part 2. We want to continue to explore things as they are in this country and how we can and will address them to improve the material conditions of our people and the country as a whole. Our community has been stifled through economic instability, marginal educational reform, a health pandemic that has disproportionately impacted and traumatized Black and brown people. While many are frustrated by the results of the current systems in place, November provides a pivotal opportunity for the voices of change to be heard. The panelists who will be coming up will discuss the actions needed in this moment to amplify our voices and mobilize our vote. This panel will focus on voter engagement and voter turnout. So let me introduce the panelists. With us this afternoon is Mark Morial. Mark Morial has been described as one of the nation's national leaders who possesses both street smarts and boardroom savvy. He's the current president and CEO of the National Urban League, the nation's largest historic civil rights and urban advocacy organization. He served as the highly successful and popular mayor of New Orleans, as well as the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Previously, he was a Louisiana state senator, a lawyer in New Orleans with an active and high-profile practice, and a leading voice on the national stage in the battle for jobs, education, housing, and voting rights. graduate of Georgetown University Law Center and University of Pennsylvania. I know he wants to give shout outs to those two institutions. He's been recognized as one of the 100 most influential Black Americans by Ebony Magazine, one of the 50 top nonprofit leaders by the Nonprofit Times, and one of the 100 most influential Black lawyers in America. He's also been inducted into the International Civil Rights Walk of Fame in Atlanta, Georgia. And joining Mark Morial this afternoon, or let me also indicate Mark is a good friend, someone who I admire and respect. And another good friend who I admire and respect, and joining Mark on this panel is Jamal Watkins. Jamal Watkins serves as the Vice President of Civic Engagement at the NAACP, leading the association's efforts to maximize the African American community's participation and representation in our democracy. Mr. Watkins previously served as the National Outreach Director at the AFL-CIO. He was responsible for strengthening and growing national strategic partnerships with the labor movement across a range of priority campaigns and program work. Prior to joining the AFL-CIO, Mr. Watkins held leadership positions in a number of organizations dedicated to community organizing and civil and human rights. These include Deputy National Political Director at Service Employees International Union, Chief of Staff at the Center for Social Inclusion, Managing Director for Campaigns for Amnesty International, the world's largest grassroots human rights organization, and Deputy and Interim Executive Director of City of Los Angeles, a national nonprofit AmeriCorps organization serving young people. Mr. Watkins has worked in several distinct arenas, including politics, campaigns, communications, education, human resources, and fundraising, and he plays a key role at the NAACP. Now, there's more here that I was provided to introduce Jamal, but let's conclude by saying he is a very prestigious brother who is leading some amazing and important work at NAACP. So to you, Jamal, and to Mark, who I think will be joining us shortly, I want to say welcome, and we're glad to have this opportunity to have this dialogue with you two distinguished brothers. Let me just offer a bit of framing, then we'll jump right into it, all right? Black voter turnout fell in 2016, even as a record number of Americans cast their ballots. A record 137.5 million Americans voted in the 2016 presidential election. Those are great numbers, although, we still fail to get as many eligible people who can vote to vote, but 137.5 million was quite significant. Overall voter turnout, defined the share of adult U.S. citizens who cast ballots, was 61.4% in 2016. A share similar to 2012, but below the 63.6% who voted in 2008. Nationwide, the census found Black voter turnout was 59.6% in 2016, which was also down quite sharply from the 66.6% of Black folk who voted in 2012. In fact, it was the lowest Black turnout rate since 2000. The 2016 rate was lower than white voters, who were at 65.3%, but higher than other minority groups. In 2012, Black voters had a higher turnout than white voters for the first time, according to the census. In 2020, we want to ensure that we reverse the turnout scenario we saw in 2016 and encourage folks to vote in numbers that certainly rival 2000. But I also have a suspicion that these numbers in 2020 are going to have to exceed 2000 if we're going to have the voice and the power that we need in order to move an agenda for racial and social justice in this country. So that's the framing that I want to provide for us this afternoon. I do see Jamal on the screen. So Jamal, I want to welcome you to this panel. It's really an honor for me. Welcome you to a panel in your own organization. But I that your organization wanted your voice, your perspective heard. So thank you for being with us this evening.
Well, Reverend Herring, as you know, we are excited to be in partnership with Faith in Action, and under your leadership, we have seen a tremendous connectivity of our organization, your organization, and the faith communities that we are embedded with and embedded in. And so in many ways, this conversation, and I think there's a bit of irony that it's going to be, 3 Black men following powerful panel of Black women really talk about what it means in this moment to engage our community, mobilize our community, and really unpack the notion of turnout. So, I'm grateful to be with you. And I know that as President Morial is joining us, we'll be able to engage in a dialogue that really lifts up what it means across our respective organizations to get it right in terms of the job we have to get done by November 3rd.
Oh, it's great to hear your perspective and to hear your encouragement. I know these are the things that you work on every day at NAACP, and you're right, Jamal. The relationship between NAACP and Faith in Action, FIA, is a strong and close one, and getting stronger and closer every day. And I know we certainly at Faith in Action are the beneficiaries of our brotherhood and sisterhood with you all over there at NAACP. Jamal, before we get into some of the prepared questions, I really wanted to give you an extra minute to speak to and share with those who are tuning in. What's the passion that you're feeling right now for both the enterprise of voting and the kind of civic engagement that we need now and into the future? Where's that passion coming from for you?
I would say when we think about where we are in this country, COVID-19 has threw us all for a loop. No one expected that we would be in the middle of a global health pandemic, one that really showed the cracks in our system as it relates to the communities that we're a part of, the Black community, the Latinx community, the AAPI community. And so COVID-19 was the first hit we took, once we got past the impeachment hearings that were taking place earlier this year. And then you saw this pivot in our communities where racism started to rear its ugly head, not only in the disparities related to COVID-19, but a series of extrajudicial killings that took place. Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. These names are sort of burned into our psyche this year because many of us were stuck at home, safe at home, and we had to watch and witness a man die for almost 9 minutes. We had to watch and witness a response that was lackluster, I think, for many in political leadership, especially here in the White House, which is not too far from where I live. And so when you talk about the passion of what people are feeling right now as it relates to voting, I think it's because our lives have been completely disrupted. And for Black folks, our lives are in danger. And if you are a parent, if you're thinking about your child and whether or not they go back to school, and say you live in Florida where the governor says schools are open, but if coronavirus is having an outbreak in a school and someone dies, we have to keep it under wraps, then you know that your vote is about your life depending on it. And so I think that's the passion, not only of the NAACP, but across our communities, our movements, and it actually goes beyond Black folks. I guarantee to white folks, Latino folks, Asian folks, you will find that there are families, communities that are saying they're sick and tired, they're done dying at the hands of politicians who are making the wrong choices for our community. So I think that's where the fire within is sort of burning. And in this moment, folks are easily connecting the dots.
That is so right on, Jamal. Really appreciate those words. And you're right, by framing it in the context of both this pandemic and our continual effort to receive justice in this country. We are joined, it looks like right now, by our other esteemed panelists. Now, I am not this brother's pastor. Let me tell you, this brother operates under the Lord's favor. It is a real honor to bring to you. I've already introduction, so you know.
The event starts.
This background and history.
Let me. I want to just take this opportunity. Yeah, can you guys hear me? Is everything good?
We can hear you.
Appreciate. So I want to thank you, Reverend Herring, for all of your always inspiration, leadership, and work, and great collaborative spirit. Jamal, I want to thank the NAACP and its president, Derek Johnson, and just as I'm proud to be participating in the NAACP conference. And maybe maybe you don't know, I started in the NAACP as a member of the NAACP Youth Council when I was 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, because my father was branch president in New Orleans in the 1960s. In fact, 1962 to 1965. And I proudly would carry the NAACP Youth Council card with me wherever I went. He later had the opportunity, he was a big ally and friend of Ben Hooks and served on the NAACP board in the late 80s after he left being mayor of New Orleans. So I'm proud to be here today in this moment, in this time, where all of us, Reverend Herring and the NAA, the NAACP and PICO and Faith in Action, and all of us have sought and endeavored to work more closely together on a wide range of issues. And we know where we are with this cascade of pandemics, but the discussion has to always be, how do we act? How do we make sure this moment turns into a movement? So I'm just proud to be able to be part of this discussion today.
Well, it's our honor as well. And as you know, in this segment, we really want to talk to the very thing that you're pointing your finger at right now, Brother Morial, and that is this upcoming election and the effort to ensure that we are represented in historic numbers at the polls and beyond.
Yes.
I framed it by sharing that there was a significant drop-off in Black voter participation in 2016. My first question to you and Jamal is, in your opinion, what happened in 2016? Why was there this historic drop-off?
Well, I believe in 2016 there was a confluence of events. I think that number one, I think that the candidacy of Hillary Clinton was not sufficiently focused on grassroots engagement and organizing and being really intentional and new school about the Black community. The Black community of 2016 and its thought process approach to elected politics was different than 1992 or 1996, because we had the presidency of Barack Obama and the hopes that he inspired and the intentionality he brought to a number of issues. So the expectations were high. I also believe that voter suppression played a role in 2016. Voter suppression in terms of voter ID and purging and all sorts of nefarious tactics, and voter suppression by the Russian Federation in the internet space to discourage people from voting, to create chaos and confusion. It's well documented by the Senate Intelligence Committee, by the German Marshall Fund, by everyone who looked at it, that the intentionality of Russia was to suppress African American voters. And it had an effect. Look at the turnout in Detroit. Look at the turnout in Milwaukee. Look at the turnout in Philadelphia, key states, key cities, and key states that ultimately determine the outcome. We cannot be bamboozled. We cannot be tricked into a narrative that voting doesn't count. The Supreme Court is on the ballot. Criminal justice reform is on the ballot. Police reimagination is on the ballot. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is on the ballot. Equity in schools is on the ballot. The challenge is to vote for someone who's best aligned with your values, with your aspirations. Maybe not perfectly aligned, but best aligned or better aligned, because an election is a contest, and it's a comparative contest, and it's a competition between, in this case, a presidential election with two candidates. So we've got to really, really work hard. The National Urban League, through our Reclaim Your Vote campaign, is working in states across the nation. We've got 19 organizers out there. We've got Urban League affiliate leaders and volunteers engaged, working, fighting to encourage every vote, meeting people where they are, having the conversations, and helping people to understand how to vote, because it's different in each jurisdiction. Some have options to vote by mail. Some have options to vote early in person. Some states require you to only vote on election day. So we want people to understand their voting options and to choose one now and have a plan to vote.
And I would say that, President Morial is literally, onto the right framework around what took place in 2016. As a former mayor and as the son of a former mayor of a major city, I know you understand the importance of leadership and a candidate that speaks not only to the community, but is a part of the community and embedded in the community. And what we found in 2016 was there was a disconnect. Folks didn't necessarily feel that the candidates were representing who they were in that point in time. And that's not a knock on anyone who was running for office, but it's to say that when we think about fatigue, the notion that, we put our hopes in a candidate, if you will, we have to pivot away from that and get back to exactly what you lifted up, the issues. What matters to community members, what matters to voters. When you think about it right now, if you go to any family that has a child, like I lifted up earlier, education matters. What happens in schools and teachers matters. And if we're not speaking to that, then we're completely missing the mark. And so as we start to unpack the notion of disinformation and misinformation, we know that Facebook and platforms like Facebook that allow for misinformation and disinformation to continue to flow, we have to counter that. We have to actually give folks the right information and cut through the noise to make it easy for folks to understand how they can participate, what's on the ballot, what it means to vote, and then what happens after the election, because we know November 3rd is a marker. It's not the end point. It means we got a lot of work to do to get ourselves out of the ditch. And I would say that Faith in Action, the Urban League, and our partners are very clear that one of the things we got to bring back to our communities is people talking to people.
Yes.
Made that hard. That means we got to put on masks and gloves and be socially distant, but we still have to make sure that we're communicating with our neighbors, our family members, and our friends to speak truth to power so that folks who are frustrated know that, guess what? The governor you're dealing with right now doesn't have to be the governor you deal with after November 3rd. The mayor you're dealing with right now could be a new mayor come November 3rd. And so connecting the dots is really going to be key, because 2016 showed us that it's not enough to wait for a savior. No, we're not waiting on somebody to come and save us. We have to actually speak to our communities, speak to our families, and save ourselves, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate both of y'all's perspective on it. I want to actually follow that up a little bit, because I think you're pointing to something really very helpful and very important. In well over 30 states, there are active, organized, well-financed efforts, both legal and otherwise, to disenfranchise Black and brown voters and to suppress our vote. We know that. We have become, unfortunately, students of that. We understand these processes, understand what the intent is. There have been folks who've been even very unashamed in saying that as a part of their strategy for victory, they must suppress the Black vote. 68, Dr. King's last speech, he said there are two forces that we must continue to do battle with: the forces of nullification and interposition. Those forces that try to nullify us, erase us, and erase our power, and those forces that would try to put in our place, in our way, barriers and stumbling blocks that would make it hard for us to be who we know we should be. So that is the backdrop. What is your recipe, your instruction for us to how to defeat the active efforts to suppress our vote? I want you to actually look at this question from the most aggressive, assertive place you can, as though we are in a battle, because I believe we are. So you two are generals right now. How do we actively defeat these efforts to separate us from our vote and our power?
I'll take a first shot. First thing we do, we vote, we vote, we vote. We don't allow the notion that someone's trying to suppress our vote to get in the way of us showing up at the polling place and demanding the right to vote and being absolutely prepared. The second thing is we have to elect people to public office who want to pass anti-voter suppression legislation. The Voting Rights Act, which was undercut by the Supreme Court in 2013, prevented voter suppression from taking place in the South because it required the Justice Department to pre-approve many practices and all changes in voting laws in those covered Southern states. So we've got to elect people. So candidates who want your vote, call the question: what is your position on voter suppression? Will you support a new Voting Rights Act we have to get active and we have to get involved. And what we have to do is also, we have to debunk this bogus theory, absolutely bogus theory, that there's fraud in the elections process. Fraud, the suppressors will try anything. If we concede it to them on the issue of voter ID, next year they'll say, well, you need to bring your birth certificate and an ID to the polls. If we concede it to them on voter ID, they'll do as they have done in this election cycle. They'll attack the postal service and the post office system, which, by the way, the National Urban League has sued the Postal Service, and we've sued the Census to challenge their actions in trying to undercut vote by mail. So we have to fight and work and use our brain power and our political power to fight against voter suppression. Why it bothers me so greatly is any trip to the history of the 1880s, the 1890s, and the early 19th century. It looks eerily familiar as you saw Southern states pass racist constitutions and begin this process of passing the grandfather clause, the literacy test, and also sending armed militias to the polling places to block Black people from voting. When you hear, I'll send the police, I'll send the sheriff to the polling place, it's the same thing. It's nothing but a naked, old-fashioned intimidation tactic.
Jamal, I'd love to hear you.
Reverend Herring, I would say, and I'm recollecting, I was in Georgia in 2018, knocking on doors alongside my president and CEO, Derek Johnson. We saw the excitement of folks getting behind leader Stacy Abrams. We knew that this was going to be a turning point in our country. And then the next day, the very next day, election day, we got news that folks showed up at the polls in line, long lines, Fulton County, DeKalb County, Gwinnett County, all across the Atlanta metro area. And several of the polling places who had polling machines did not have power cords. I'm gonna say that again. Folks showed up to vote, ready to vote, and the polling machines did not have the power cords in order to function. And it just so happened that Leader Abrams was running against the man in charge of setting up polling locations. In that moment, we saw what it took to jump into action. So the lawyers started filing injunctions, folks started advocating on the news. We saw people in line being encouraged, food being brought. And what it really showed, I think, and what President Morial lifted up, is that the first and foremost thing we have to continue to do is vote, vote, vote. If the vote wasn't important, then the power cords would have been there. The second thing I realized in that moment is that when we think about the courts and lawyers, we have very powerful giants in our community who have utilized the courts to help get us some relief. We have to make sure that we sue everybody possible. As the young folks say, you can catch these hands, you can catch this lawsuit. Because when we think about the courts, we have to make sure that we're using that power no matter what. And then the third piece, which I don't want to make sure we lose heart in, is that in a COVID reality, we got to keep people in the field. Today is National Black Voter Day. We, Urban League, BET, and other partners, to say we have to lift up what it means in our community to participate. We have folks right now today across the country with lit, with masks, with shirts, passing out information, doing voter registration drives. We're calling it a no contact canvas, but we still have to make sure we have a presence and that we don't retreat. Because, you know, if the power cords don't show up, there's a way to find them and get them there on time. And so at the end of the day, as a general in this army, if you will, and as lieutenants in this army, we have to fight forward like never before. And that means utilizing the courts. That means making sure that folks are voting like their lives depend on it, and making sure that people are still in community, sharing information, spreading the real news, and countering disinformation.
That's super helpful. I want to switch up a little bit, but stay inside of this space around voting. On the segment prior to this, as Jamal indicated earlier, There were 4 very powerful women who we all know in leadership roles, really working very hard every day and sacrificing very hard every day to lead this country, and lead major organizations. We're 3 men on this call. And it's often said that Black women are voting and are engaged in rates and levels that are not paralleled by Black men. And we're 3 Black men on this call. First of all, any comment you would want to make on that? And then the other comment would be, how do we get brothers to get more involved in this process, more involved in civic engagement, more involved in voting? And then how do we get them to stay on the field once the election is over?
We have to be willing to meet brothers in the community, have the conversations, and realize that many Black men are ailing, joblessness, mass incarceration, lots of challenges that are specific and unique to Black men's existence in the United States. We've got to meet Black men where they are, and we've got to encourage that conversation. We've got to create inspiration, and it's about understanding what our power really is. And we have to do it while applauding the great success of our sisters, the great success of the women who now occupy leadership positions in civil rights organizations today, many in important leadership positions. So it's changed, Reverend Herring. When I joined the National Urban League, 17 years ago, the number of women in leadership positions in civil rights was much smaller than it is today. Now we have organizations led by women. I know even within the National Urban League, maybe 50% of our local leaders are women, strong women, dynamic women, intelligent women, leading in Louisville on the Breonna Taylor issue, leading in Rochester, leading in communities across the nation, in Kansas City, working on police reimagination and transformation efforts. So we've got to applaud the sisters, but we have to meet brothers where they are and have that conversation one-on-one in groups. And brothers, we need to understand we have power to make a difference in our own lives. We cannot be silent. We cannot be spectators. We cannot be observers.
You know, I appreciate this question, and I appreciate what President Morial just lifted up. You know, being raised in a family of not only strong Black men, but strong Black women, I know to this day, my mother, Wanda, if she called me, she can put me in check, tell me what to do, and get me right. I'm going to do it. And I think we have to recognize in our community that we have known the power and strength of Black women since day one and have to continue to lift that up. But then there's another side to it that I know we are constantly wrestling with. I happen to be a part of a fraternity celebrating 21 years as a member of Alpha Phi Alpha, and understanding that notion of brotherhood. How do we actually make sure that the translation of brotherhood goes beyond fraternity? It goes in community. And what that means when I think about my own biological brothers, I have 2 younger brothers, one that's in his late 20s, one in his early 30s. We have to have tough conversations with each other. We actually have to lift up the fact that I know it's hard to watch an issue like George Floyd being killed, then be expected to go to work the next day, whether it's on Zoom or in person, and smile and act like nothing is happening. Yeah. We know it's hard to go and function in an economy where you do and work twice as hard and get half as much. And so in many ways, the conversations have to be about us addressing the issues directly, but also owning the reality that the Democratic Party, just like the Republican Party, is not going to be the solution. That we have to figure out how we're the solution. And to President Morial's point, understanding that we have economic power, we have academic power, we have power. And if we start to leverage that as a community and really translate brotherhood to amongst all of us, then and only then can we pivot from the paradigm that Black women are outpacing Black men, but that we're running alongside each other together, the race together. That's a tough conversation for some of us, but we have to keep doing it and meeting each other, as you said, where we are.
Yeah. No, it's so important that we're talking about Black women, talking about Black men. Now let's talk about young brothers and sisters. And as you know, many millennials, Gen Z, Gen X, and the Zoomer generation, they're not happy with the things are in this country, and they have good reason not to be happy. And they're also saying that they're very skeptical about the vote and about whether or not they'll actually vote. What say you to young brothers and sisters out there who are sitting on the fence or are deciding right now that they're not going to participate?
Well, let me say this. Protest is a first step.
Amen.
Voting is a next step. Continuing to protest and advocate and hold accountable is a further step. If you are not at the table, you are on the menu. If we're not in the game, we're out of luck. We have no chance to impact anything. We live in a democracy or in a system where voting is power. And voting means the people who are selected through the voting process make the rules. They make the economic policy. They decide how the federal budget gets chopped up and distributed. They make a decision if they're in the United States Senate on who gets approved to become a federal judge in your hometown, in my hometown, in all of our hometowns. We need to understand some basic civics, that it ain't cool to not vote. Martin King, Malcolm said the ballot or the bullet, and he preferred the ballot. Martin King and John Lewis and Whitney Young and that great generation, A. Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins, the essence of their work was that they were fighting for the right to vote and fighting for full participation in American society. We can't betray that legacy. We can't surrender our future. So young people, we need you. This future is yours. Your ability to impact an election is so profound. Don't give up that power.
And you know, I would lean in and say a few things. The first is that we have to shift the paradigm in the conversation that you can be revolutionary and dismantle systems and rebuild systems, and at the same time take over what's already there. And duality is something that for many of us, when we start to walk in that concept and in that framework, it changes the conversation. It doesn't mean that you have to go along to get along and accept what's there. But, you know, my grandma taught me a long time ago that you need folks in the street, you need folks in the hallway, and you need folks in the boardroom. And if all of them are aligned, that's how you actually have a power shift. And so I'm a little bit past the millennial age, but working with amazing young people, when I think of like Leslie Redmond in Minneapolis, who is under 30, when I think of Amari Fenoy in Georgia, who is the head of the Youth and College Division there, our staff, Wisdom Cole, Gina Lawrence, the person that put on this virtual convention, there's a whole lot of young people who understand that while we may not be happy with the status quo, and we got to reimagine and rebuild that, we also have to make sure we don't lose what's already there, and we got to have that takeover spirit. It's almost a merger of Du Bois meets Booker T. Washington. And for some people, they say, no, you can't bring those two together, but our community knows that you can. You can elect a new mayor and at the same time reconstruct what it means to do public safety work in that same city under that mayor. And so if we are able to teach ourselves and each other how to operate in these ways, then I do think you're going to get more involvement, because then you change the discussion from elect this person to save us, and actually let's look at the system holistically and make sure that we're each playing our part and working in our lane, so that when this is all over, we have a system that we've imagined and reimagined, and at the same time, we were in the driver's seat of making sure it got there.
Those are really very helpful perspectives, great answers. If you would forgive me for a moment, I would also just add one thing. The Israelites were beset by an amazing army led by a giant named Goliath, who was diabolical and bloodthirsty. And in the ranks of the Israelites felt that Goliath was he was undefeatable, and they spears and lances and arrows and every weapon they had until a little farmer boy came up and said, "Hey, I'll take him on." And they said, what do you have to fight with? And he says, "I'll tell you what, in a fight, you pick up anything close to you." So he picked up a rock. He picked up several of them. And we know the rest of the story. He felled Goliath and the people were victorious. I think of the vote as a rock. It's available to us. And in a fight, you want to pick up anything that you can and put it to the best use. The vote, to me, is that I've been sharing that story with young people, as you imagine a clergy person would, and some have found it persuasive. Let's we only have a few minutes left. I just wish we had more time.
Yeah, and Reverend Herring and Jamal, I've got to excuse myself for another call.
Right.
But Jamal, thank you for your great words. And Reverend Herring, thank you for your continuing inspiration. And thanks to the NAACP. And Reverend Herring, may I have your permission to borrow that story?
You sure can. Go right ahead. Do you want to make any closing statements before you have to step out?
All I want to say is today's National Black Voter Day. Tonight, BET.com, 8 p.m. We'll all be on, continuing to push. And let's remember, we must vote. A voteless people is a hopeless people. We got to vote.
You're leaving us a great instruction. So take care, dear brother.
Okay, God bless y'all. Thanks.
God bless you. Now, Reverend Herring, you said something that I wanted to actually connect the dots on. When you talk about David and Goliath and the power of that, we actually have a thing called the power of 5. Because as you know, the number of stones is counted as 5. And so work we are doing today in the field is a part of what we're calling the power of 5. Between now and National Voter Registration Day on the 22nd is 5 days. And we are lifting up the 5 different ways in which you, as a member of our community, can be empowered to change what is happening in this country. So it's not just voter registration, but it's the census, it's understanding the policy fights in your community, it's talking with your neighbors and connecting the dots, it's lifting up messages that work, messages of hope, and it's tying it all together. So that's notion of David and Goliath. That's the thing that resonates with us across all age groups and across many different communities, faith communities, et cetera. So the fact that you chose to share that, I think, is divinely inspired, because that's literally what our folks are doing for the next 5 days. And that's the story and the motivation behind it.
Oh, that is great. That's great. I mean, I think that people who are listening into this conversation now, I think should feel encouraged, particularly as you walk us through some of the things that NAACP is doing. On the 22nd, that's when all of us will take a big step forward in our work to get people to the polls. So we will announce our new voting program to add to our already existing effort to bring 1 million people into conversation about the vote and hopefully bringing them into the polls. And I know that NAACP has also tremendous, not only a body of work, but tremendous plans in these last few days. I think we're under 50 days now before the election. One of the important backdrops for this, and we only have a few minutes left, Jamal, but I really want to get your quick comment on this. One of the important backdrops in this election season is this global pandemic, COVID-19, and all the conversation about how will you vote, in person, by mail, absentee, and all of the efforts that are being made, including injuring the U.S. Postal Service, decreasing their budget, literally pulling up post boxes off of sidewalks and warehousing them. With all of that, but with this COVID-19 especially, give us some of your thoughts about how should our community navigate this important election against the backdrop of this deadly virus?
Well, one of the things our president and CEO, Derek Johnson, our chair, Leon Russell, our vice chair, Karen Boykin-Towns, a lot of leaders that are in our ecosystem are pushing a very simple message of know how you can vote in your community and vote as early as possible. For example, if you go to naacp.org/engage, it takes you to this web landing page that's about Black voices changing lives. And you can go to the button called Commit to Vote. There you can find information on how to request a ballot, all the voting laws in your community, because every county, every state is different. You also can find information about how to actually make a vote plan, where you do some things on the website, and then we send you reminders. And what we're really saying to folks is the earlier you can vote, the better. So in North Carolina, folks have already started voting. They can request their ballot by mail, either drop it off at a designated drop-off location or send it in by mail. So that's the first thing we're promoting. The second thing that we're promoting, and you know this because the faith community, I think, has adopted this well, is continue to engage even if you have to do it virtually.
Right.
So on a Zoom platform or another platform, and in the church service, make sure that your pastor or your faith leader is reminding folks about the deadlines of when they can register to vote, when they can request a ballot. Getting that information out virtually matters. So we're running programs like phone banking and text messaging and campaigns that are really going to connect the dots through radio and digital. So we want to make sure in that second category, we're using the tools that we have been gifted in order to reach folks. And then the third piece that we're really lifting up is to listen to the health experts. There are some folks who said, I don't know if COVID-19 or coronavirus is real. And we saw some Black folks who was following Donald Trump at the rallies, and some of them are no longer here with us. So we don't want to be foolish in the way in which we're navigating. And so we're asking our folks, if you're going to be in community and with community, use social distancing. Think about having information that you can leave on someone's door or someone's car. Think about drive-through voter registration. Sort of really be smart about how you engage with community so that you're not putting your health at risk. Now, that's not to say don't vote in person, because I know there's some folks who are going to say, I'm voting on election day or during early vote. I'm going to put on 10 masks and 10 gloves, and I'm going to be wrapped up and tangled up and ready to vote. And that's okay, but also make sure that you're following the CDC rules that keep us socially distanced and compliant. And so that's how the NAACP is navigating it. And I know most of our partners are doing the same. And I'm curious, Reverend Herring, from your perspective, how is the church and the faith community also navigating COVID-19? Because I know it has to be tough, because when you congregate, it's usually with people and in person.
Right.
What does that shift mean to you all?
No, it's a real challenge, Jamal. First of all, thank you for really good guidance and good wisdom about how to navigate this important election against the backdrop of this deadly pandemic. I think for many faith leaders and for many faith institutions, this is an extraordinary challenge. You know, at the heart of faith and at the heart of faith institutions is something that you and I and people like us talk about a lot, and that is relational organizing. Yeah. We're organizing around a theme of love for God and God's people. And we're responding to a commandment that we should love all people and love justice especially. What we say at Faith in Action is that justice is what faith should look like in public. And for many folks who are clergy and for many faith institutions, the fact that folks can't be together in person, can't really relate to one another, and continue to water these close and even familial bonds that they have is quite a challenge. As you know, and including this conference, many things are happening online, virtually, and digitally. And certainly the church is following suit and trying to find creative and clever and thoughtful ways to keep people together and give people opportunities, albeit electronically, to stay in community with each other. But you put your finger on something that's absolutely critical in this moment, whether we're meeting in person or virtually, and that is our intention to still be in communication with each other, to still offer ourselves, our pulpits, our airwaves as instruments of information where people can get good advice, get timely advice and timely instruction, where people can lift up and post things that they've learned, things that they're understanding, things that they are uncovering, like where do you go to sign up for a vote? Some folks have never voted absentee. How do you actually do that? And if you have an absentee ballot, where do you take it to? Who do you drop it off with? And if you go to the polls, what do you need to know in order to make sure that you're safe and others are safe? I think for many people, the last time they saw people standing for an election, it was probably during this primary season, and they saw people out the door, around the corner, and down the block. even with this pandemic. And I think many folks were really chilled by that did not look healthy. It did not look safe. And in many communities, particularly where there's a strategy to suppress our vote, there's been no extraordinary measures taken to ensure people's safety and security. So you're absolutely right. People have to pay attention to where they can get good information. And we know in the Black community, one of the most reliable sources of good information is the church, our religious institutions. Now, let me answer your question within the context of talking about young people, because lots of research shows, lots of polling shows that young people may not be going to church in the same rate that their parents or grandparents did. So how might the church impact them? I think what you're seeing right now are congregations led by really thoughtful, woke leaders who are taking the message to the people, who are using an opportunity to provide their church as a COVID-19 testing center, who are opening up not just the ordinary food bank and clothes closet, but they're closely coordinating with leading grocery stores and other actors in the community to provide real food and real nourishment, that they're working with local school boards to ensure that children have the ability to participate in school with all of the electronic and technical gear that they might need and support that they might need. And so what many churches are doing is that they are answering the call of this moment and are emerging outside of the walls of the church and are really taking the message and taking the work to the people. And I also know that many of those congregations are led by sisters and brothers who are also NAACP members. And some of them are NAACP chairpersons, right? Who are NAACP local leaders, right? And so I think those things are really, really important right now. But Jamal, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, those folks who may not know what Jamal's work is. Jamal, aside from being this very thoughtful brother who's representing the NAACP in this moment on these very thorny questions, he's up to his eyeballs every day in the data side of things and the technical side of things and what this really looks like, the voting operations, what they really look like on the inside. And Jamal, are there any insights from that you want to bring to us? I know oftentimes folks who work in the number spaces, in the digital spaces, in the research space, they often say, well, no one really knows what we do, nor are they concerned with or interested in what we do, but I am, and I think others are as well. What do you want to bring us from that side of the voting engagement effort that could really help us understand better this moment?
Reverend Herring, I think one of the things that America and the world has gotten used to recently is looking at maps and data. Right. You think about coronavirus and the outbreaks, there's always a map that shows what's happening in this country or this city. For civic engagement, we use the same types of maps to really spell out who's voting, who's not voting, where are folks that are unregistered versus registered, who actually took the census. Every day we get a report from the Bureau that shows who has responded to the census by percentage. And it's this notion of mapping us in NAACP plus Faith in Action, Unidos, Urban League, other organizations have been a part of this data analytics space. Your team member, Risa Brown, has been amazing. And the connectivity is, how do we make it so that in a limited resource environment, if I know that this neighborhood is registered and they're voting at a high rate, above 80%, we may need to take our time and talent down the road to a neighborhood that's not so active in terms of voting and that's not so connected, so that we can push more information, send mail, text messages, and reach the community there. That's the heart of the NAACP Civic Engagement Program. And with our partners, it's about finding folks where they are and hopefully motivating them to get deeper and more connected into voting and being connected to the work in community. That's pretty much what we're doing, but the data is all there. It's just a matter of pulling it together and making it digestible so that a local pastor will know, oh, I got 50 people I need to register in this neighborhood to make sure that our folks are participating. Or here's some folks that I can send a text message to make sure that they're connected to the work because they haven't voted as often as they could. That literally is what we are wrestling with and doing between now over the next 46 days to get us through a successful election turnout program.
I just really think that that's so important that you're taking us kind of behind the curtain and talking about the intricate details of this, because I don't think people really understand this. That this is a very sophisticated effort that your organization is mounting, so is mine. with hundreds of thousands of dollars of investment. Some of the brightest, sharpest young brothers and sisters are working in all of these data spaces, all these communication spaces. This is not just a notion that we have, but we're devoting, in the aggregate, millions of dollars to this, hundreds of thousands of person hours, of very detailed and intricate plans. And I think people would be really proud of what your organization is doing, what other organizations are doing. And we are really trying our very best. And we know that we're outfunded. We know that folks have the leverage of government on their side. We may be outfunded, but we are not outfoxed. We certainly are not outgunned, because we do have this extraordinary advantage. And that is that we have historically understood the power of our relationships. And we build on that power in the ways that you've talked about. We're gonna have to close in a couple of minutes, but I really wanted you to have a moment to make any last thought or ideas that you want to share with us, or any last encouragement. Why don't you take a minute or so to do that? I'll close this out and we'll turn it over to the folks in the control room and let them take us further in this 111th convention of NAACP.
Well, Reverend Herring, you know you are family with the NAACP and a respected leader, not only in my own family, but in our broader community. And I thank you for lifting up the fact that we're doing this work together. And when I think about where we are in this country, I'm reminded of a story that I've read about and that I've heard about from my president and CEO who lives in Mississippi, about Fannie Lou Hamer. And she gave this example of this notion of, you know, if you have your foot on my neck in a ditch, the thing that I'm telling you is take your foot off my neck so that we can both get out of the ditch and figure out how to get out of the ditch. When we think about where we are in this country, COVID-19, racial tensions, disinformation, we're in a ditch. And so if you have to put your foot on somebody else's neck, think about it. We're still all in this ditch. How do we turn around together and get ourselves out of the crisis we find ourselves in? Dig us out of this ditch and really have an America that is what it ought to be and not what it is. That is the message that I know the NAACP, our partners, our community members, the communities we serve actually care about. And so if we're gonna make a difference, we gotta speak to that reality that no one wants to be sick and tired and dying and broke. We all wanna have a prosperous life and to feel like there's hope and there's future, but that means we gotta do some work. And as you said, voting is a part of that. But there's the other side, which is holding folks accountable, advocating, and continuing like never before. We are 111 years old, and I believe we're just getting started. And so I'm grateful that the spirit, power, and energy of our movement and our communities, volunteers, the faith community, et cetera, are fighting forward like never before. And I think that's what's going to make a difference on November 3rd and beyond.
So well said. And my brother, your president, Derek Johnson, would be so proud and enthusiastic about the ideas that you shared with us all in this last hour. Boy, an hour sure did go by really fast. I'm reminded of one of Dr. King's favorite mentors, Vernon Johns. Vernon Johns said, as he was fighting for civil rights all throughout the South, that if you see a good fight, get in it. And I believe that this is a good fight, worthy of us and worthy of this generation and worthy of the NAACP, worthy of my organization, Faith in Action, worthy of Mark's organization, the Urban League, and so many of our brothers and sisters. I believe it's worthy of all of us in this moment. And I will end this with a calling, putting out the call to everyone who's tuned in and to those who for whom the NAACP has always been a beacon of hope and light. This is a moment like no other moment. You are needed. Your power, your vision, your leadership, and in this instance, your vote. I want to thank you all for tuning in. Thank you again, Jamal. Thank you, Mark Marielle, for joining us earlier. And thank you, NAACP. 111 years young, still going strong, and consider Faith in Action your constant and loving and supportive partner in your work. Take care, everyone, and thanks for tuning in.
Welcome to the 2020 NAACP convention. This panel is All In, the Fight for Democracy. The film by the same name is out on Amazon today. And right now we're gonna start with the trailer.
If the power of the right to vote was truly made available to everyone in America, it would change the future of this nation.
Ladies and gentlemen, Stacy Abrams!
When I started running for governor, we anticipated that voter suppression was going to be instrumental in Ryan Kemp's campaign, and we were right.
We've been in line for 5 hours.
They said, you've already voted. Looks like several days ago. No, I would have remembered that.
Thousands of people were told no and didn't have the authority to demand better.
These lines are insane. We have precinct consolidation, non-training of local election officials.
I knew something had gone horribly wrong. The system that is supposed to protect our democracy didn't work the way it was supposed to.
States implement voter suppression laws all across the country.
Things like new voter ID laws, purging. You're knocked off the roll. Gerrymandering.
Changing the voting boundaries.
Ohio is a use it or lose it state.
In the United States, the right to vote is the only right you can lose simply for not using it.
Jim Crow 2.0, that's what we're saying. We've got a lot of work to do.
When we started as a country,
6% of people were eligible to vote. There are still forces that are determined to keep citizens from voting.
Unless we fight for the right to vote, our democracy is put at risk.
The fight over voting rights is ultimately about power.
The states have figured out how to stop African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, the young, and the poor from voting.
history is never a straight line. It's always a fight.
I will not concede because the erosion of our democracy is not right.
We try to make history.
The vote matters.
You belong. You have value.
And joining us today to talk about the film, to talk about voting, voter suppression, voting rights, and so much more about voting is Liz Garbus, who is a filmmaker and co-director of All In, The Fight for Democracy, Lisa Cortez, filmmaker and also co-director, Stacy Abrams, founder of Fair Fight Action, and my governor, Derek Johnson, president and CEO of the NAACP. Thank you all so much for joining me this morning to talk about this great, important film, and also all that we need to know going towards this election day. No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to start with the filmmakers. Why this film and why now?
You know, Angela, is one of the people in our film says it's going to be the people who saves us. You know, like we are who we have been waiting for, and this is the time now to be educated about the issues, make a plan, and mobilize. And, you know, we're artists and we're activists. And this is a platform that, you know, really spoke to us as a means of achieving these goals.
I get it. What about you, Liz?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that your governor, Stacy Abrams, said the first time I met her was, you know, so often people show up at the polls and if they're told, you know, they're not registered or there was some problem, they're not on the rolls, they think, you know, my bad, I must have done something wrong. I must not have, you know, filled out some form. And I think what we wanted to do in this film is trace our history so you understand that these problems you're facing are a feature, not a bug in the system, that they're designed to discourage you from voting and from participating. And I think if we kind of wanted to instill that righteous anger, like this is yours, don't let anyone take it from you, and give you the knowledge and information. So that's why now we want people to know, not just the ancestors, the shoulders that they're standing on and all the fight that has come before them, but that this is something that's theirs. And if we give them the tools and the knowledge that they need, they can protect that which is theirs and not let anyone steal their voice.
I think so often, Stacy, when folks talk about your work, they think about you just in running for governor, but they don't realize before running for governor, you were the minority leader, that you were founder of the New Georgia Project, that you have also started Fair Fight. And I want for a moment for you to just talk about the connective tissue that has existed in your career, a longstanding career in fighting for voter protection and against voter suppression for Black people in all marginalized communities.
Thanks, Angela. So I'm the daughter of two civil rights activists. My parents were involved in the civil rights movement in Hattiesburg, Mississippi as teenagers. My father was arrested at the age of 14, helping to register people to vote. We tease him that my mom was doing the same work, she just managed not to get caught. But for both of them, the right to vote was something they weren't legally eligible for because they grew up in the segregated South. And even if they were eligible, they wouldn't have been eligible until the age of 21. So as 14-year-olds, they understood how important this right was, especially the fact that it was being denied to their parents, to their grandparents. So, I grew up in a family where my parents took us out to protest with them. We protested apartheid, we protested gang violence, but they also took us with them to vote every single time. And I'm one of 6 kids, so we look like make way for ducklings trailing out of the voting booth. So by the time I was 17 and at Spelman College, I set up my first voter registration table in the quad at Spelman in Manley Plaza. I went from there and did a lot of work working in labor, working in civil rights, but always connecting to the question of the right to vote, because the right to vote is what undergirds everything you have in a democracy. It is the key to our power. And so for many years, my focus was on how do you increase civic engagement among young people? How do you increase civic engagement among communities of color? But in the wake of the decimation of the Voting Rights Act and the unfortunate times that preceded it, for most of the 21st century, my fight has been about protecting the right to vote. Instead of expanding, it's just holding serve, getting us back to where we were before the 21st century brought in this new wave of voter suppression and activism against communities having whole access to the right to vote, particularly the Black community.
And Derek, people need to know you didn't just pop up one day in the NAACP president and CEO role. You also have been doing this work for a long time, some with Stacy, some without, and you stand on the shoulders of some great, great freedom fighters in the voting rights struggle, Medgar Evers and Fannie Lou Hamer, just to name a couple. Can you talk about what the NAACP is doing right now to build upon the great work that you've been doing and so many others?
Thank you, Angela, for hosting this panel, and thank all the panelists for joining this conversation. Before I start about me, I just want to talk about the documentary. It was great. It really exemplified the power of the visual art and the narrative. Oftentimes we take for granted the power of the visual art, the narrative. But for us in this moment, we must understand that we didn't wake up in this posture, that there's a long history that brought us here. Not only if there's a long history that brought us here, there's some very intentionality to exclude our voices in this democracy. And it's systemic. And so the film really highlight the efforts to exclude the voices of African Americans. For me, moving from Detroit to come to Mississippi to attend Tougaloo College, and on that college campus where social justice is a part of the norm, it allowed me an opportunity to be my Blackest on campus without fear of the outside world. And that's the beautiful thing about HBCU. It's almost like a cocoon. You can get on that campus and you can explore. I needed that. I was a student who graduated from high school with a 1.8 GPA. But on that campus, I began to understand what was possible because on campus were civil rights veterans who will always visit. Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture would come every year to campus. Congressman Thompson's an alumni of Tougaloo, and many, many others. And so I was able to immerse myself in that culture. But in doing so, it forced me to understand my responsibility. And that responsibility is to speak for those who could not speak for themselves, those individuals who grew up in the neighborhood. I grew up in Detroit, a working class neighborhood, and I'm the first of my family to complete college. And so this moment right now is the makings of many, many individuals who invested in me, whether it's the cafeteria woman in middle school who will always give me an extra ice cream sandwich, or the one in high school who would give me an extra slice of pizza. And I'm doing this work for them because those are the low-wage workers that we ride through their neighborhoods and we look down because we see blight. But those are individuals who work every day. And voting is the vehicle by which their tax dollars that they put so much of their income into should reflect their needs, their interests. That's why this moment for me being a seat is so important. But most importantly, that's why looking at the power of that film, that documentary, hearing Stacy's voice and that narrative, understanding the impact it can have on future generations is something that I celebrate as we continue to work.
Thank you, Derek. And I want to talk about the film, but I am just trying to lay the groundwork. Dee, I think it's important for people to understand the many layers of suppressive behavior, the many ways in which all of you all have built up careers, whether through storytelling or through activism and advocacy to fight against the systems as they were designed, as it was originally stated earlier. And I think, Stacy, this is a good time to talk about the census. You recently authored an op-ed with Congressmember Karen Bass, who is also the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, talking about the many ways in which the Trump administration, these are my words, not the NAACP's, is really causing not just a significant, let me rephrase that. How the Trump administration is making it more difficult, or trying to make it more difficult, for people in marginalized communities to be counted. This, of course, is yet another form of suppression. Talk about the history that ties those two things, both our voting rights and our ability to be counted, and how us failing to be counted on purpose could actually backfire in the long run.
So in addition to being privileged to work with Lisa and Liz on the documentary this year, All In, I also wrote a book called Our Time Is Now, The Power, Purpose, and the Fight for Fair America. And I dedicate a whole chapter in this book about suppression. I dedicate it to the census because it is one of those pieces of our Constitution and our daily lives that very few of us think about. It's this count that happens every 10 years, and it mostly seems like an annoyance. People invading our privacy every 10 years, asking us for information we don't want to give, and we don't know why they need it. But when you dig beneath the surface, the census, especially for the Black community, is the one way we have consistently not only shown up, but it's how we have gained access to power and privilege over time. Because in the original census, that's when we talk about the 3/5 compromise, it was the census that was the 3/5. They counted for every 5 Black people, they only gave us credit for 3 of us. And that's why the phrase whole persons is in the Constitution. It was about Black people. And so once we became more and more engaged in the full life of our citizenship, which didn't happen until 150 years ago, we became more and more engaged, and we started getting our economic resources and our political power from the census. And in fact, we have reached this inflection point as a nation where there are so many people of color that our presence and our power is real. And that's why we are watching the Trump administration, and it's not partisan. He is in charge of the census, and they have intentionally done everything in their power to undermine the accuracy and the quality of the census, beginning with underfunding it by almost $5 billion. And it took the work of the NAACP, it took the work of Karen Bass and the CBC, of the tri-caucuses, to force that money into the budget at the end of 2019. But what we've seen in the midst of COVID is both the reason the census matters and why they are so terrified of it being accurate. We know that there have been a disproportionate number of Black folks who have been harmed economically and health-wise by COVID-19. But the resources that pay for our hospitals, the resources that pay for PPE, the resources that are going to be poured into this country for recovery, all of those dollars are going to be directed based on the census. And because Black folks were undercounted in 2010, we got less of the resources we needed in 2020, because this is a 10-year deal. I like to tell folks, if you have a utility bill or a cell phone, they already know how to find you. Filling out the census is how you get what you deserve. It's how you get your economic power, the $1.5 trillion that will be allocated every single year. But if you undercount Black and brown communities, if you undercount the poor, those dollars don't disappear. They just get redirected to wealthier, whiter communities. And by the same token, our political power is at stake here. We've watched in the last few election cycles as more and more people of color, especially more and more Black people, have gotten elected to positions of power from school board all the way to Congress. The political districts that are drawn to permit us to elect people we think can represent us, those lines are drawn based on the census. And what the Trump administration is doing right now by artificially ending the census is they are attempting to erase Black and brown communities from the narrative. And I'm not being facetious. They literally are going to undercount us, and then they're going to use something called statistical imputation to guess who's missing. But when you're guessing, they use the communities that actually showed up. And right now, that's majority white communities, which means if they guess about whether Black people live in a neighborhood, if it's been gentrified at all, or if it's a smaller enclave, we will likely be guessed to be white, which means when they're drawing those lines, we do not get representation, and that will diminish our districts. And what will end up happening, and this was in a memo that the Republican Party commissioned that Trump used to direct some of his efforts, we will look whiter and more Republican than we have in the last 20 years. So fill out the census. Go to my2020census.gov. The last day to fill out the census is September 30th. We need you to fill out the census, and if you need to do it by phone, it's 844-330-2020, 844-330-2020. Fill out the census.
So just really quickly, Stacy, and to all of you, really, so often we are sounding an alarm, right? We're sounding an alarm about being counted for the census. We're sounding an alarm about showing up to the ballot booth and being counted in that way, ensuring that your voice is heard, ensuring that the people who are elected know that they serve you as well. What did we say to the folks who hear the alarms and have now kind of let it kind of just drip like, I can't, it's too much, there's COVID now, there's, racial injustice, there's too many alarms, I don't know why I should pay attention to this one. When you think about the backdrop of all in, why is it important for them to be all in with their votes?
Well, I'll start. Voting is a process, just like change. And we are trying to combat diseases, the disease of COVID, the disease of racism, the disease of economic inequality. And there is no disease where you take a magic pill and it's suddenly fine. It's a process. It's like chemotherapy or radiation. You've got to do it over and over and over again. And it sometimes doesn't look like you're making progress. And sometimes the pain of the treatment is worse than the disease sometimes. And so what I like to think about voting is a process. It is how we make change, but we can't stop, because the minute we stop taking our medicine, it gets worse, because the disease doesn't go away because you start taking your medicine. You're fighting it. And this is a constant battle. And that's why all in is so important to me. And it's why the NAACP is so important, because if it was about winning one moment, then yeah, you can do it. But evil is persistent. Power is hard to take and it's hard to hold. And so voting is about our constant fight to hold that power. And the reality is, if we keep doing it, if we assiduously apply ourselves, it may feel like we're not making a lot of progress, but I think everyone on this panel can tell you progress has been made, and we're getting more and more power as we go, because there are more and more of us, which means because we survived everything else, we're getting to the place where our ability to make those changes becomes faster and faster. We're getting closer to a cure.
I always say voting will establish the value proposition. People go out and they elect policymakers to reflect the needs and interests of the majority of those who were successful. That's the value proposition. The next step is the most important step, is those policymakers then implementing public policy to cement those value propositions in ways in which it reflects the needs and interests. And far too often, we think the transaction of the election day is the sum total. In many ways, it's the starting point for much of what we need to address. Systemic racism is decades or centuries long, and it's public policy. And that public policy must be addressed, but you cannot address it if you don't have policymakers that reflect the value proposition that you need them to carry into office. And so the freedom song of the song, what is it? Freedom is a constant struggle, right? It is a constant struggle. It is the process of always moving forward. And for anyone to say there's been no process, they don't understand the historical arc that we've been on. They don't appreciate the opposition that we've been up against, and they have devalued all the ancestors who have sacrificed so much for us to be in this moment. It is our responsibility to carry it forward and to do so with the understanding that social justice isn't a competition. It is room for all of our voices. It is an opportunity for the best of us, however we are positioned, whether it's organizational identities, individual identities, gender. We cannot afford to be a us versus us, because it is going to take all of us to go up against the opposition that is historical in nature and these thirst for powers. The guardrails of the rules as we know it will be thrown out the window. We're seeing that with this current administration. Rules don't apply because power is on the table. So the question for us, how do we leverage the power that we have, the currency through the vote, to really push forward the value proposition to speak for those who can't speak for themselves?
So I want to switch gears a little bit, Derek, to that point. We know today is the announcement of a key partnership with BT, NAACP, and other civil rights orgs, the first ever National Black Voter Day, to address and to fight against voter suppression and to ensure our votes are counted in November. For a moment, let's talk about the other aspects of the fight for democracy, right? That going to the polls is just one way. Let's talk about some of the highlights, some of the folks you all feature in the film, Lisa and Liz. What are some of the other ways that people engage in the fight, this very necessary fight as we get closer to November?
Well, I mean, one of the stories we follow in the film is the work of Desmond Meade in Florida. You know, Desmond Meade is a returning citizen, and what that means is he's somebody who has served his time in prison and has returned to society. And he, you know, there had been a movement in Florida to advocate, you know, lawmakers for re-enfranchising folks who had lost their right to vote because of felonies. Florida is one of a small number of states which permanently disenfranchised those who were those who had been convicted of felonies. And he was not able to move the needle by lobbying lawmakers, so he took it upon himself to form his organization, the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, to advocate, to collect signatures so that Amendment 4 could be put on the ballot. Amendment 4 said that once your time is served, you return to society as a citizen, and the key to citizenship, as we all know, is having your voice heard in our democracy, the right to vote. So Amendment 4, they went door to door, got it on the ballot, and it passed overwhelmingly in Florida, 64%. You know, nothing in Florida passes overwhelmingly anymore, but this did. You know, since that victory, the courts have been, you know, and the Florida legislature has been fighting the re-enfranchisement of hundreds of thousands of citizens in Florida. And it's really, you know, it's really just a prime example of having the voices of voters mitigated by the courts and those in power, because Florida went to the polls, and yes, Republicans too voted for the re-enfranchisement of these citizens. So that's just one story of many of folks, you know, kind of working to change and make this a more inclusive democracy, you know, one signature, one vote at a time.
Really quick, I just have a note on this. I think that is so interesting, though, after that very decisive victory in Florida, that ballot initiative then went to courts because they wanted to still ensure that the folks who were returning had to pay their fines, which was argued, I think, a very sound argument in court, that is a form of a modern day poll tax. And yet the highest court, again, going back full circle to the whole point of this conversation, you get what you elect. The judges in those positions don't think like us, and therefore, right, they've upheld that that they should in fact have to pay their fines after they've done the time, after they've done all of this to get back and to feel, Stacey, as you said earlier, fully human. Like, what is the? I mean, it's such. Anyway, that's a whole other. Go ahead, Stacey.
But Angela, part of that is it was the state legislature that, watching what the people decided that they were going to superimpose their ideologies. And that's why the census matters so much, because redistricting isn't just about Congress. We talk about gerrymandering in Congress. We need to be worried about it at the state level, because when we're gerrymandered at the state level, you get legislators who decide 2/3 of the things that happen in your life. Congress is important, but Congress is a small portion of your daily life. It is your state legislature, your city council, your school board that make these choices. And those are all decided by the census. And that's why we've got to show up, because if they can erase us in the census, then what they did to Desmond Meade and to all of those returning citizens, they will do on steroids, because they now know that Desmond Meade and his groups were willing to go to the people and get things done. So they're going to do their best to shut the people down.
Yeah. But, I think all of us, the conversation we're all having is, how did we get to this moment? And when we talk about Florida, let's get in the time machine. Let's go back to 1868. And that's when Florida passed its first felony disenfranchisement law that said that anyone who is convicted, is not going to be qualified they're not going to have their rights restored. So I think what we need to start looking at is that this is intentional. This is not the first time that we're in this moment. We have been fighting this moment for, as Derek and Stacy, as Liz, we've all said, for hundreds of years. It just keeps putting a new face on. But with that knowledge, we also need to be vigilant and hopeful, and to think about what is ahead, what our goals are, how do we make a plan in the midst of a pandemic, and mobilize.
This moment is one of those inflection points in history. It's a presidential election on top of the collection of the census, and which is the forerunner of the redistricting process, leading up to a midterm election. All of those things are intersected. It doesn't always intersect as it is today. The census set the floor for the board game. The redistricting established the boundary lines by which the individuals are selected. Those individuals establish the rules, whether state, local, or in Congress. And those rules is about the allocation of the money, the tax dollars. That's the building block. And then when you overlay that with the upcoming election, among other things, we are in a real inflection point. And this election will determine whether or not we're going to move into a future that's different or go backwards to a past that we've seen before. But in this moment, it's another unique reality for us. If we go back into the past we've seen before, this administration would change the nature of what the engagement would be, because they don't care about facts. They don't care about the rule of law. They only care about power grab. I have said over and over, if we go backwards, this democracy would not look the same. It may not be able to survive. So in this moment, it is very important for us to keep our eyes on all of the moving ball, making sure there's a complete count, making sure we turn out this election cycle like we've never turned out before, and we vote from the top of the ticket to the bottom of the ticket. In Detroit, 28,000 Detroiters skipped the top of the ticket in 2016. And the state of Michigan, depending on how you look at it, was decided by less than 11,000 votes. That was the difference in the outcome in that 80% African-American city. That should tell us that neither party, in many ways, one party ignored those voters, and the other party have completely neglected those voters. At the end of the day, as African Americans, we must take our destiny in our own hands to define the path forward. Political parties are only vehicles for agendas. What will be our agenda moving forward? How will we define the makeup of either one of those political parties in a way in which it'll reflect who we are, what we need? And we cannot romanticize what has happened in the past. People talk about, Angela, you've mentioned, talked about the Black Political Convention of '72. It was a disaster, right? And
depending on who you ask, D, depending on who you ask.
Listen, I have talked to the Mari Barak camp, the Coleman Young camp, and the camps in between. We have to walk into that with a real grounded historical knowledge and not glamorize something that we call Black power, and we don't even understand how the political system works. We have to have a totality of understanding when we approach that, so we can see clearly the levers of power, how we should engage, what rules should be changed, because the rule of law is fluid, it's not stagnant. And it would change, and it's like a shapeshifter based on who hold the reins. We have to understand those things. So if we decide to do that, we need to do it with a clear understanding of all of the levels of government and all of the levers of control.
I think the NAACP should help coordinate the next one, which should be like next week. But we'll have another panel discussion on that as well. So I want to get into this part, and this is a selfish question, but I have to ask this because it's like it's just been bothering me. We say about the census, show up, be counted. We say about the vote like you never have before. D, you just said it. You got to do this. You know, our folks died for the right to vote. We know that's true. As we mourn the loss of John Lewis, we know that's true. But normally in the Black community, and I'm thinking about our two directors here, especially in the Black community, it stops there. It stops with, we need you to show up and do this. But then we don't really educate and inform our communities about all of the other aspects of engaging politically that ensures, to Derek's point, that your agenda can actually be heard and acted upon. We stop at the vote, and that's just the beginning of being all in, right? Talk about some of the other ways you talked about, Desmond. We know about the work of Stacy. Stacy is legitimately all in on all sides. So I really want to know, right, when she's awake and when she's asleep. So what are the things that we can really be honest with people about? Like, I feel like we almost are like, just do this one thing because we want to make it as easy as possible. But because we make it as easy as possible, it almost backfires. They're like, you just trying to keep me at the threshold, right, of democracy. You're not really wanting me to pour in. How do we shift that? I know that is a dangerous shift to make perhaps right now. It's a radical one. It's one that is very risky, but I think we got to be honest with people about the fullness of their power, the fullness of their worth. It's not just about them showing up to be counted and showing up to ensure that they vote. They've got to do a lot more to ensure the change that we are talking about all the time in social media comments, on TV shows. We sound real good, but the execution is off.
So I'll start. One, we have to tell the truth about what voting is. Voting is a beginning. And I like to say we have to protest in the streets, protest at the ballot box, and then we need to protest in person. And that's what you're talking about. So we can't elide any of these responsibilities. We've got to see them as a continuum. It's like playing only one part of a game. If you only show up for the first quarter, then you're probably going to lose. And so it's understanding that we have to lift our voices and protest. Derek and I got to know each other because of protest. You've got to demand what you need, but then you got to vote for people who will sustain what you've said. And then you've got to participate in person and protest in person by holding them accountable. And so, for example, with Fair Count, the organization I created for the census, we're one of the only full-time census organizations. And when I say full-time, I mean for the next 10 years, we're going to be talking about the census and what it means. This year, we're talking about getting counted, but we're also going to start talking about voting. And the voting piece is not going to be partisan. It's just you need to go vote, because the people you vote for are going to set, to Derek's point, they're going to do redistricting in 2021. But you also need to watch the budgets of your city council and the budgets of your state legislature, because they get billions of dollars based on the census. So you need to know if they spend the dollars where they should. If your school board is not increasing if they're not making sure that your classroom sizes are getting smaller and your physical plan is getting better, then they're not spending your dollars well. And so it's making sure that we have this continuum conversation. But you're absolutely right, Angela. Our responsibility is to know that it's not a one-off. And that means we have to stop lying, because we treat these things as though they are instant gratification.
Yes.
Voting does not fix anything, but voting is the only way you get to participate in the solution. Protest does not solve anything. It's the only way you tell people what you need. And protesting in person is how you hold them accountable, because if you gave a 16-year-old the keys to your store and said, make sure everything's here when I get back in 4 years, how many of you think you'd actually have something? We need to show up every day, every time, to hold them accountable, because I will tell you, as a politician, we respond to 3 things: money, peer pressure, and attention. And if you do not show up, then we will not show up to do everything we're supposed to, because we know there are no consequences for our actions.
That's why I should she's my governor, y'all. Okay. Facts only around here. So, okay, I want to jump into, let me go back to the Emmy Award winning now. The Emmy Award winning just this week for your work on the Apollo to media, the importance of media. When we think about how we change narratives, it's the media. When I think about what happened in 2016, the tragedy that was 2016, again, my words, not the NAACP's, I thought about how so often we allowed for false equivalency on air, right? We allowed for an argument that was rooted in no fact at all to go toe-to-toe with an argument that was rooted in complete facts. And so I want to hear from you all about the importance of communicating with people who have been disenfranchised, who have been marginalized, who have been treated like they don't matter, whether it's their Black lives or their Black votes, right? So why is the form of media, the way that you, the path that you chose to communicate to potential voters, to new voters, to older voters, to folks who may be low propensity voters, why is that the avenue you chose, and particularly for a project like this?
Well, Angela, you spoke to, we've been in several seasons of disinformation. And, I think documentaries provide the platform to frame through our research and through the history itself, what are the facts. But what Liz and I, in working with Stacy, strove to do with this film was to take it a step further, was to find a way to intersect the knowledge that we're providing with a very dynamic impact campaign. We're meeting people where they are. We have buses on the road that are registering folks, that are showing the film. We have a website, allinforvoting.com, where if you want to figure out everything from am I registered to how do I become a poll worker, you can go to this site. We're living in a time that so much of the rhetoric is fear-based. There's so much fuel being poured onto that fire, and we have to stay calm. We know what's ahead, and I think the more we could grid ourselves with the facts and implore the media to stay within those parameters and not be reactive, is, I think, a great part of our responsibility as storytellers, but as concerned patriots.
Powerful. Liz, what about you? Do you want to add to that?
Well, making films is what I do, and we're in a, we want to stay optimistic, but we're in a desperate moment. We're in a, we are in a crisis, and this is what I know how to do to contribute. I can't do what Stacy does or what Derek does, but I can do this. And I also think about, I talk, about the prison industrial complex with my children until the cows come home. But then they saw this movie called The 13th, and they said, "Mom, I'm going to tell you something." I'm like, wait, I made the farming goal of USA. I was talking about this. But the power of film, especially with young people, to inspire, to lift up, it's so huge. Or An Inconvenient Truth. That was a moment when that film came out that people said, "Oh, climate change, it doesn't really exist." And of course, we're still fighting that stupid battle. But, there are these moments in which you're delivering good information, and hopefully it doesn't have to even reference the bad when it's giving you this fulsome history. And especially with our young people, it becomes a touch point for them in their education about our democracy.
And with that, as we get closer to this election, of course, with I don't even want to call it a backdrop of COVID, like literally in a COVID environment, there have been a lot of conversations about how to shift, how to register, how to make sure that your ballots are counted if you're, worried about going to the polls, whether early or on actual election day. A lot of conversation has been had around mail-in voting and absentee voting. And we learned recently, especially at a congressional hearing, how much damage has been done to the U.S. Postal Service. So for those folks who were like, voter suppression, meh, you got to literally see it. For folks who paid attention to congressional hearings, I'm now showing how nerdy I am, my background. But I want for a moment for us to talk about how critical it is, how groundbreaking it is that this administration would also not just take on the census, Stacy, to your point earlier, not just ensure that there are challenges with voter suppression. We know that HR 1, which is the very first bill introduced in the United States House of Representatives in this session of Congress, that the Senate still has not taken that up. That is not a partisan matter, Derek. That is a fact. And because of that, voter protections, and as well as the Voting Rights Advancement Act also wasn't passed, now called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. So all of these things, in addition to now mail-in voting is compromised. Stacy, I know I keep picking on you, but you also wrote a piece recently, I think it was in Deadline, where you talk about all of the challenges that exist around voting, the fact that there aren't national standards. That is the very thing that these two pieces of legislation, as well as foreign interference, they took that on election security as well. What are some of the things that we can do, knowing that the Senate Majority Leader will not take up these measures because it helps his party?
So the beginning of this conversation, when I sat down with Liz to talk about doing All In, it was because voter suppression was this whisper campaign. It wasn't a national story. And part of the mission was to make sure people understood the urgency of now by understanding the through line of then. And to Derek's point, it's this arc that allows us either to connect ourselves to our history and to see our progress, or it exempts us of knowledge. And my mission was to say, look, we can't fight an enemy we don't acknowledge, that we don't see, that we don't know. And Liz said this at the very beginning. We think that these are bugs, that it's my fault, I should have known, I should have done. No, it's a feature of the system that we are distanced from our right to vote. And so in this election season, we have this real responsibility to understand all of the exposed flaws. Vote by mail is not a panacea. It is one facet of what can happen to help us vote, but it's an important one because people are dying. I live in a state where we have weak leadership, but we also have one of the highest COVID rates in the country. And we have vote by mail with no excuses. That's a good thing for people to use if they can. But the way I talk about it, it's not vote by mail should solve every problem. It can't. Vote by mail is one tool. So is voting early. You've got 41 states that currently will permit you to vote by mail with no excuses. And to talk about progress, in January of 2020, there were only 34 states that let you vote by mail with no excuses. Now we're up to 41. So our fight is working. Number two, you've got 40 states that will let you vote early. And then every state has to let you vote on election day. And so part of our responsibility of fighting back against those who suborn voter suppression, who ignore voter suppression, or who foment voter suppression is that we've got to know what it looks like so we know how to fight back. And Lisa said it many times, we have to make a plan. Make a plan to vote early. Make up your plan. If you live in one of the 41 states where you can vote by mail, go ahead and vote. You know they're going to attack it. Now that we know, we can do something about it. So make a plan to vote by mail, but make a backup plan to vote early if you live in a state where you can vote early. And then make a backup plan in case those two things fail. Because the reality is your enemy doesn't give up. I mean, it's like watching a Marvel movie. Your enemy doesn't just go away because they lose one battle. They're going to keep fighting. So we've got to keep being ready to fight back. And that's why allinforvoting.com is so important, because you can go to that website and you can make your plan. You can know what your first opportunity is, what your fallback plan is, and what your fallback plan is. That's the way we fight back, because we're not going to make Mitch McConnell a better person. We're not going to end Russian interference without congressional action, and it's not going to come. So what we can do is not let them steal our democracy from us. We can't defeat voter suppression in one cycle, but we can make it damn hard for it to exist at the fullness that they see they want to achieve.
I have to ask this really quick, Stacy, because you just brought up you're in a state with weak leadership. And one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is your own gubernatorial race. Did you win the election?
I made the very conscious choice.
Yes, she won the election.
I want her to answer this, because this is the part, y'all. This is where we mess up. So did you win the election, Stacey?
No. So Angela, I know what you're asking me, but here's and Liz can verify this.
Yeah.
When you talk about voter suppression, the minute it becomes about a single politician's election, you exempt everyone else from having any fight. The minute this becomes about me, in 2018, on November 16th, if I had said, I am fighting a battle to make myself governor, I would have been doing a disservice to the hundreds of thousands of Georgians who had their votes stolen. My obligation is not to get an office. My responsibility is to fix a system that stole the voices and the votes of hundreds of thousands of Georgians. And so I know what you're asking, and I appreciate it. And I am deeply honored when people are willing to speak up. But as a politician, I have to make a very conscious choice to keep the attention on the voters who are having their voices stolen. I'm not entitled to an office, but as an American, I'm entitled to a vote.
Now here's the
thing. So let me jump in.
Hold on, D, because now we started to fight. Here's the thing. It would be different, Stacy, if your track record before you ran for office isn't what it was. It would be different if your track record after having not being named governor, not being sworn in as governor, wasn't what it was. I think it is key that we give people anecdotal evidence of what happens when suppression wins, when the former Secretary of State now becomes the governor, when there are poll results that they literally can't find the receipts, right? The paper receipts for. Why we tell people we are all on our phones, but we need you to go to paper because you can't trust this stuff. We have to tell people this, because if we don't, we're only exacerbating the problem. We're only doing the go out to vote. This is the most critical election of your life. That was the most critical election of a lot of people's lives, and their votes weren't counted. Their voices weren't heard.
Absolutely, which is why I made a whole film, wrote a whole book, and have talked. I have relived the worst day of my life in public for 2 years.
Yeah.
So I hear you, and I appreciate your point. But part of, if you look at my whole track record, I'm never going to be the person who says I got robbed, because the minute I say that, it detracts from everything else that I talk about, because people are only going to hear that. I wasn't robbed. Georgians did not have their voices heard, and that's the problem. And I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican or an independent, no one has the right to steal your vote. That's got to be the issue.
Yeah.
That's the difference between egocentric leadership and community-centric leadership. This is not about the person. Ella Baker was perhaps the most genius of the civil rights movement. I think the greatest was A. Philip Randolph. One of the most genius was Ella Baker. And her quote was, "Strong people don't need strong leaders. What we actually need is a community-centric minded approach to address the systems that are against us." And I love the way the documentary started off with Stacy standing on stage, says, this guy will be announced the winner. She didn't concede. She acknowledged that the announcement was forthcoming, but she also signaled the ongoing fight that's necessary to make democracy work for us. And when we fall into this messianic leadership model, that is the first day we start losing the progress that has been achieved. Early on, I was about to talk about managing success successfully. Managing success successfully is recognized when you have success, helping people see it and then protecting it. But also managing success successfully is recognizing the fight that you're in. Seeing it's not about you and your own ego self, and empowering other people around you. Leadership is about pushing local leadership forward so their voices can be heard. They can drive the direction. That's the beautiful thing that I took from the documentary. That's the thing I love most about Stacy, because it's not about her in the moment. It's about the infrastructures that have been put in place to prevent us to fully participate, not only as citizens, but fully aspire to our greatest heights as individuals and as a community.
Okay.
That's really important for us.
Sorry, D. Okay, here's the
But
thing. Now
Angela,
y'all,
can I just
say,
you know,
go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say it is tragic. No, it is tragic and it is wrong. And as a Georgian, you should be allowed to grieve. You know, I think that, you know, and we see the consequences so starkly with this pandemic on weak leadership, right? And you know, and so I think as a Georgian, that tragedy is felt and the film honors it. But, you know, as Stacy said when we first started making this film, you know, if it's about me, then somebody can write this issue off. You can say, this is Georgia. Oh, this is about Stacy. Oh, you know, but when we open up the lens wide and we see how this election, what happened in Georgia, is what's happening in our country on overdrive, on steroids, then we can, you know, take it and make it productive and widen out. But but the tragedy of what happened for Georgians is very real. And, you know, while Stacy can't say it, it is something that, you know, we center in the film, because it tells that it's that story that helps us tell the larger one.
And the beautiful thing about Stacy is she was organized in her effort to put on display what so many communities across the country have witnessed, the theft of their franchise.
Yes.
And in the past, others may have known the theft exists. We have witnessed it, but she was able to put on display for the nation to see the theft of the franchise.
So here's the question. When we go back to this film, All In, and we relitigate 2018 and 2016, because Stacy, no, you weren't the only one, but my point is this: when we tell people to go and be counted, when we tell people to go and cast their ballots, and they did that, and justice says their voices, you know, that they won, but they don't get to celebrate in that victory. That's not just about Stacy, Derek. That's not about messianic leadership. That's not any of those things. It is, how do we thread the needle of, we're asking you to do something where the last time you did it, you didn't get to celebrate what you know was yours. We have to thread that needle, because there are people who, you know, like me, I'm like, I don't understand how we can tell people to do something and it's still not secure. It's still not going to necessarily result in the end goal you desire, because the system is so flawed. And there are things literally sitting on the desk of the United States Senate to fix this. Like, to me, and I was saying this all up until the last 50 days of this election, or 40 plus days now. We have to get people to engage. And Stacy, that's why I asked the question earlier too about we can't just tell people to go and be counted. Like, right? It's like all of these things at the same time. We're asking them to both put their faith and their energy behind a system that is so flawed. It could result in an election result that isn't what is the actual truth. That's maddening.
But think about all the times we actually succeeded recently.
Yeah.
In 2018, managing our success successfully. How are we communicating that message? How are we allowing people to see the building blocks of their success? How are we linking up the opportunity that we may have had a setback here, but look at the 9 times we had some advancements. That's what I'm talking about, managing our success successfully. We have to, as a community, get out of the deficit mindset and start owning all of who we are. We have overcome tremendous odds, but that doesn't mean there are not going to be other hurdles in front of us.
Yeah, that's real. I know that we are over time, but it was starting to get so good. And if we're honest, y'all, like, we know these are the kitchen table conversations that our family members are having, or now these days Zoom conversations, and this is just the beginning. All in, the fight for our democracy is out now. These are Emmy award-winning directors and filmmakers. Please support this, and then have this same argument with your folks at home.
So, and I'm sure y'all going to submit this for an Image Awards. Please do, okay? Please submit it. Okay.
Lisa and Stacy and Liz and President Derrick Johnson, I thank you all so much. I'm about to get some t-shirts made that says Stacy is my governor. That's the takeaway. Okay.
Thanks, Angela.
I love y'all. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for doing this.
I've been flipping through my timeline, trying to get my mind right. My city cried out, I got to cool down, but I'm under pressure. Looking with my Crisco, look at where my fist go. A renegade when I'm in a rage. I got to cool down, but I'm under pressure. I keep my hands dirty.